know that this is a live camera. I can't see that Dave, I don't know why. It's strange that they don't
Yeah, no, you do see that. But they don't say, no, I would
see what.
Ah, sì?
Good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be joined today by Elizabeth Whelan, Paul Whelan's sister, and by my colleagues from Canada and Ireland. In a few moments, we will head into the Security Council for a meeting about how we can make multilateralism more effective and defend the UN Charter. But it's impossible to ignore the giant elephant in the room, Russia. Russia, the convener of today's meeting, invaded its neighbors in Ukraine and struck at the heart of the UN Charter. And Russia, time and time again, has violated universal human rights and fundamental freedoms, both outside and inside its own borders. That includes arbitrarily detaining political activists, journalists, and opposition leaders, as well as the wrongful detention of American citizens. Right now, Paul Whelan is in a Russian penal colony simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And right now, Evan Gershkovich is being wrongfully detained by the Russian government simply for doing his job as a respected journalist, as you are doing here today. Of course, Paul and Evan are also beloved friends. They're sons, they are brothers. There's a human cost to Russia's violation of international norms, to its barbaric practice of using people as political pawns. That cost is borne by those detained, but also by their family and friends, as Paul's sister here with me today can attest to. Since the earliest days of this administration, we have sought to bring Paul Whelan home. As Secretary Blinken said recently, the United States has made a proposal for Paul's release, and we urge Russia to move on that proposal. It's time to let Paul come home. In the meantime, we will not stop, we will not rest, and we will not relent until Paul, Evan, and all hostages and wrongfully detained Americans are brought back safe and sound. Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. 1 second, I have some notes. I'm Elizabeth Whelan, the sister of Paul Whelan, who has been wrongfully detained in Russia since December 2018. When on a visit to Moscow, Paul Whelan was set up by the Russian security services, the FSB, and arrested on false charges of espionage. He was held for 1.5 years at Lefortovo prison, where journalist Evan Gershkovich is currently being held on the same charges. This Russian playbook is so lazy that even Evan has the same investigator, a man who harassed and interrogated my brother until Paul's sham trial in June of 2020, when Paul was given a horrific sentence of 16 years for a crime he did not commit. Now Paul is being held in labor camp IK-17 in the remote province of Mordovia.
My remarks with a few words on Sudan, where the situation continues to worsen. Since the start of fighting on 15 April, hundreds of people have been killed and thousands injured. The violence must stop. It risks a catastrophic conflagration within Sudan that could engulf the whole region and beyond. I strongly condemn the indiscriminate bombardment of civilian areas, including healthcare facilities. And I call on the parties to stop combat operations in densely populated areas and to allow unhindered humanitarian aid operations. Civilians must be able to access food, water, and other essential supplies and evacuate from combat zones. I am in constant contact with the parties to the conflict, and I've called on them to de-escalate tensions and to return to the negotiating table. We will continue our efforts with our partners to secure a permanent halt to the fighting as soon as possible. Working with humanitarian organizations on the ground, we are reconfiguring our presence in Sudan to enable us to continue supporting the Sudanese people. Let me be clear, the United Nations is not leaving Sudan. Our commitment is to the Sudanese people in support of their wishes for a peaceful and secure future. We stand with them at this terrible time. I've authorized the temporary relocation both inside and outside Sudan of some United Nations personnel and of families. I call on all Council members to exert maximum leverage with the parties to end the violence, restore order, and return to the path of the democratic transition. We must all do everything within our power to pull Sudan back from the edge of the abyss. Mr. President, thank you for convening the Security Council today around the important issue of effective multilateralism. Multilateral cooperation is the beating heart of the United Nations, its raison d'être and guiding vision. The establishment of the United Nations in 1945 represented humanity's best attempt to prevent any repetition of the horrors of two world wars and the Holocaust. Over the past 78 years, the multilateral system has held together and delivered some notable successes. The tools and mechanisms established by the Charter have played their part in averting a third world war. Peacemaking and preventive diplomacy by the United Nations have helped end conflicts around the world. United Nations peacekeeping operations have helped societies move away from conflict, saving perhaps millions of lives. Our disarmament and non-proliferation efforts have helped to confine nuclear weapons to a handful of states. And the United Nations was central to the decolonization process and the independence of 80 former colonies, today members of the UN. We have helped to advance economic and social progress and contributed to reducing poverty and hunger, eradicating diseases, and building recognition and respect for fundamental human rights. The global humanitarian system, coordinated by the United Nations, saves millions of lives each year. And multilateral solutions to global problems, from the ozone layer to the eradication of polio, are tried, tested, and proven to work. None of this progress would have been possible without countries standing together as a multilateral human family, which makes today's situation all more dangerous. We face unprecedented and interlocking crises, but the multilateral system is under greater strain than at any time since the creation of the United Nations. Tensions between major powers are at an historic high. So are the risks of conflict through misadventure or miscalculation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in violation of the United Nations Charter and international law, is causing massive suffering and devastation to the country and its people, and adding to the global economic dislocation triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Elsewhere, conflicts green dawn, from Myanmar to the Sahel, from Somalia to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and beyond. The situation in Sudan now threatens to destabilize the entire region. While there are some promising developments in Yemen and Libya, more than 100 million people have fled their homes to escape violence, conflict and persecution around the world. Effective multilateral responses are urgently needed to prevent and resolve conflicts, manage economic uncertainty, rescue the Sustainable Development Goals, and address challenges to the global norms against the use and possession of nuclear weapons. We are witnessing a deepening climate crisis, soaring inequalities, a rising threat from terrorism, a global pushback against human rights and gender equality, and the unregulated development of dangerous technologies. All these global challenges can only be solved through respect to international law, adherence to global commitments, and the adoption of appropriate frameworks of multilateral governance. Mr. President, Excellencies, as difficult as the past year has been, I am heartened that Member States have made progress in several crucial areas. A binding treaty on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity was finalized. COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh achieved a breakthrough in addressing loss and damage caused by climate change. The General Assembly recognized the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, and these developments are important and their effects could be far-reaching. The Black Sea Grain Initiative and Memorandum of Understanding to facilitate the export of Russian food and fertilizers are compelling examples of the significance of multilateral cooperation facilitated by the United Nations. And they clearly demonstrate that such cooperation is essential to create a greater security and prosperity for all, and I urge their continued implementation. But we need to do better, go further, and work faster. That must start with countries recommitting to their obligations under the United Nations Charter, putting human rights and dignity first, and prioritizing the prevention of conflicts and crises. The principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and reinforced in the Declaration on Friendly Relations and Cooperation among States, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of all states, non-interference in the affairs of other states, the elimination of all forms of discrimination, and the peaceful settlement of disputes are bulwarks against uncertainty and fragmentation. They are the foundation of all international cooperation to end conflicts, save lives, protect human rights, and promote social and economic progress. Second, I urge Member States to use the full range of diplomatic tools that the UN Charter provides for the peaceful resolution of conflicts. And these include the use of my good offices to help resolve disputes and secure peace. Third, effective multilateralism must include a commitment to tackling new and emerging challenges and filling gaps in global governance to achieve the promise of the Charter in the 21st century. This is the driving force behind my report on our common agenda, including the proposed new agenda for peace. The new agenda for peace would offer a unifying vision anchored in trust, universality, and solidarity. It would address all forms and domains of threats, taking a holistic view of the peace continuum from prevention, peacemaking, and peacekeeping to peace-building and sustainable development. It will underline preventive action as a priority at all levels. Our common agenda envisions multilateralism that is more inclusive, with space for the contributions of all countries and communities, and more network, with strong links between the United Nations family, international financial institutions, regional organizations, trading blocs, and others. Member States are in the lead on adapting intergovernmental organs to meet changing needs. A majority now acknowledge that the Security Council itself would benefit from reforms that reflect today's geopolitical reality. And the same is true for the Bretton Woods institutions. They do not reflect also the reality of today's global economy. The High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism that I appointed last year has identified a number of transformational shifts to address peace and security challenges, growing economic inequalities, the triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity and pollution, and the widening digital divide. I hope their report will make a significant contribution to our collective reflection in the lead-up to the Summit of the Future next year. And I count on your engagement and support in preparations for the summit. Mr. President, Excellencies, Our institution was created for crisis. Throughout its history, the United Nations has overcome seemingly intractable conflicts and deep divisions. We must find a way forward and act now, as we have done before, to stop the slide towards chaos and conflict. It's time to deepen cooperation, to strengthen multilateral institutions, to find common solutions to common challenges. Members of this Council, particularly those that enjoy the privilege of serving permanently, have a particular responsibility to make multilateralism work rather than contribute to its dismemberment. Competition between states is inevitable, but that should not rule out cooperation where shared interests and the greater good are at stake. And when competition escalates to confrontation, the multilateral system, founded on the Charter and international law, is the most effective means to manage disputes peacefully. We must cooperate. We must adapt multilateral institutions and foster trust where it's most needed. And the urgency of global challenges demands bold and swift action, and I thank you.
Я благодарю
I thank
генерального секретаря
the
за
Secretary General of the United
его
Nations for
брифинг,
his
и
briefing,
сейчас
and
сделаю
I will
заявление
now
в своем
deliver a
качестве
statement in my
министра
capacity
иностранных
as
дел
the
Российской
Minister for Foreign
Федерации.
Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Уважаемый господин генеральный секретарь,
Mr. Secretary
уважаемые
General,
коллеги,
distinguished colleagues,
символично, что мы
it is
проводим наше
symbolic that
заседание в
we are holding
Международный день
today's meeting on the International
многосторонности
Day
и
of
дипломатии
Multilateralism
во
and
имя мира,
Diplomacy for
введенный
Peace,
в
which
календарь
has been enshrined
знаменательный
on
дат
the
резолюции
calendar
Генеральной
of
Ассамблеи ООН
significant dates
12
of
декабря
the General Assembly resolution
2018
dating
года.
12 December 2018.
Через 2 недели мы будем отмечать
In 2
78-ю
weeks, we
годовщину
will
победы во
commemorate
Второй
the
мировой войне.
78th
Разгром
anniversary of the
нацистской
victory
Германии,
during the
решающий
Second
вклад в
World
который
War.
внесла моя
The
страна
defeat of
при
Nazi
поддержке
Germany, where my
союзников,
country with support of allies made a
позволил
decisive
заложить фундамент
contribution,
послевоенного
set the
международного
foundation
порядка.
for
Его
the
правовой
post-war
основой стал
international
Устав
order.
ООН,
Its
а сама
legal
наша организация,
foundation became a part
воплощая
of the United
истинную
Nations, and
многосторонность,
our
обрела
organization, the
центральную
embodiment of
координирующую роль в
genuine
мировой политике.
multilateralism, gained
Без
central
малого
coordinating
80
role
лет
in
своего
international
существования
politics.
ООН
In
выполняет
80 years of its
возложенную на
existence, the
нее
United
отцами
Nations has
основателями
delivered
важнейшую
on
миссию.
the key mission
Несколько
which was
десятилетий
entrusted to it by the
базовое
founding fathers.
взаимопонимание
For
5
several
постоянных
decades,
членов
the
Совета
core mutual understanding of
Безопасности
the
о
5
верховенстве
permanent
целей и
members of the
принципов
Security Council
Устава
on the
гарантировало
supremacy
глобальную
of the goals and
безопасность и тем
principles of
самым
the
создавало
Charter
условия для
guaranteed global
по-настоящему
security, and
многостороннего
thereby created
сотрудничества,
conditions for genuine
регулируемого
multilateral
общепризнанными
cooperation,
нормами международного
governed by
права.
universally recognized
Сейчас
norms of international
ООН-центричная
law.
система переживает
Now, the
глубокий
United
кризис.
Nations-centered system
Первопричиной
is
стало
enduring a
стремление
profound
отдельных
crisis. The
членов нашей
root cause was the
организации
desire of
подменить
some members of our
международное право и
organization to
устав
replace
ООН
international
неким
law and the
порядком,
United
основанным
Nations
на
Charter
правилах.
with a certain
Эти правила никто не видел, они
rules-based
не были
order.
предметом
Nobody has seen
прозрачных
these rules.
международных
They were not the
переговоров.
subject of
Они
transparent
изобретаются
international
и применяются
negotiations. They are
с целью
devised,
противодействия
crafted, and
естественным
applied
процессам
with
формирования
the goal of
новых
countering the natural
самостоятельных центров
process of the
развития,
establishment of new
которые и
independent
есть
development
объективное
centers,
проявление
which are
многосторонности.
the objective
Их пытаются
manifestation of
сдержать
multilateralism. There are attempts to
нелегитимными
deter
односторонними
them
мерами, включая
with
перекрытие
illegitimate
доступа к
unilateral
современным
measures.
технологиям и
These include
финансовым
barring
услугам,
access to modern
вытеснение
technologies and
из
financial
цепочек
services.
поставок,
They include
конфискацию
expulsion from
собственности,
supply
уничтожение
chains, confiscation
критической
of
инфраструктуры
property,
конкурентов,
destruction of critical infrastructure
манипуляция
of
с универсально
competitors, and
согласованными
manipulation
нормами
with
и
universally
процедурами.
agreed upon
Как
norms and
результат фрагментации
procedures. As
мировой
a result,
торговли, развал
global
рыночных
trade has become
механизмов,
fragmented,
паралич
market
Всемирной
mechanisms
торговой
have
организации
collapsed, the World
и
Trade Organization
окончательное,
has become
уже
paralyzed,
без
and now,
маскировки,
clearly and
превращение
openly,
Международного
the
валютного
International
фонда в
Monetary
инструмент
Fund has
достижения целей
morphed
Соединенных
into a
Штатов и их
tool for the
союзников,
achievement of the goals of the United
включая
States and their
цели
allies,
военного характера.
including goals of a military
В отчаянной
nature.
попытке
In a
утвердить свое
desperate
господство через
attempt
наказание
to
непослушных,
assert
непослушных
their
США пошли
domination
на
by
разрушение
punishing their
глобализации,
insubordinates, the United
которую
States
долгие
has
годы
taken the
превозносили
path of
как
destroying
высшее благо
globalization, which for
всего
many years they
человечества,
have
обслуживающее
they have
многостороннюю
raised up
систему
as the
мировой
highest
экономики.
benefit of all of
Вашингтон и
humanity,
подчинившийся ему остальной
advancing
Запад
the multilateral
задействует свои
system,
правила
global
всякий
economic
раз,
system,
когда нужно
Washington, and
оправдать
its
нелегитимные
Western
шаги против тех,
subordinates
кто выстраивает
leverage
свою
those
политику в
rules every
соответствии с
time they need to
международным
justify
правом и
illegitimate attempts
отказывается
against
следовать
those
корыстным
who
интересам
base their
золотого
policies in
миллиарда.
line with international
Несогласных
law and
заносят в
those
черные
who
списки, а принципу «кто
abandon
не с нами,
the
тот против нас».
parochial interest of the
Западным
global
коллегам давно стало
billion.
неудобно
The
договариваться в
Western
универсальных
colleagues have
форматах,
long
таких как
found it
ООН.
inconvenient
Для
to reach agreement
идеологического
through universal
обоснования курса
formats
на
such as the
подрыв
United Nations. For
многосторонности
ideological justified policy to undermine multilateralism in abandonment of democracy and countering autocracy. Beyond the Summit for Democracy, where self-proclaimed hegemon determines composition, there are other clubs of select individuals are adopted. The Summit for Democracy, the Alliance for Multilateralism, the Global Partnership for Artificial Intellect, the Global Coalition for Freedom of Media, the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. All of these and other exclusive projects have been devised to undermine negotiations on relevant themes under the aegis of the United Nations, to impose non-consensual concepts and decisions that are convenient for the West, and these are proposed as a position of the international community. Let's call a spade a spade. Nobody allowed the Western minority to speak on behalf of all of humankind. There's a need to be polite and to respect all members of the international community. By imposing a rules-based order, it sponsors arrogantly reject the key principle of the Charter of the United Nations, namely sovereign equality of states. The quintessential nature of the complex of superiority or exceptionalism was the lordly statement of the head of the European Union head, Joseph Borrell, stating that Europe is a heavenly garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. I would also quote the joint declaration of NATO-EU dating 10 January 2023, which states, I quote, "The United West will leverage all economic, financial, political, and, I would note this in particular, military instruments at the disposal of NATO and the EU for the advancement of the interests of our common billion." That is what the declaration states. The collective West has arrogantly reshaped and tailored processes of multilateralism at the regional level for the advancement of their interests. Just recently, the United States called for the Monroe Doctrine to be revived, demanding that Latin American countries limit ties with the Russian Federation and People's Republic of China. This policy, however, came up against the decisive focus of countries in the region to strengthen their own multilateral structures, first and foremost, to select and to uphold their legitimate right to stand as a pillar of the multilateral world order. The Russian Federation fully supports these justified aspirations. Now, there have been significant forces in the United States and allies to undermine multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region, and this cooperation around economy and security has for decades been unfolding around ASEAN. This system allowed for consensual approaches to be established, which were beneficial to the 10 members, the dozen members of ASEAN and their partners in dialogue, including Russia, China, the US, India, Japan, Australia, Republic of Korea, which provided for genuine inclusive multilateralism. By advancing the Indo-Pacific strategy, Washington has embraced a policy of destroying this established architecture. And during the last NATO summit in Madrid, there was an assertion of all peace lovers about the exclusively peaceful nature of their military programs, announcing global responsibility and divisibility of security in the Euro-Atlantic and the so-called Indo-Pacific region. So now, the policy of NATO, as of course a defensive organization, is now moved to western shores of the Pacific Ocean. The bloc-based approaches undermine the Asia-centric mindsets, and they are manifest in the creation of a military alliance, AUKUS, which has now embraced Tokyo, Seoul, and a number of ASEAN countries under the aegis of the U.S. Mechanisms for intervention in maritime security issues have been established to uphold the unilateral interests of the West. Mr. Borrell, who I mentioned, he promised yesterday to send EU military naval forces to that region. It is not concealed that the goal of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to deter China and to isolate Russia, and this is how Western colleagues view effective multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region. After the collapse of the Warsaw Treaty Organization and the Soviet Union departing from the stage, a hope was fermented for the advancement of the principles of genuine, inclusive multilateralism in the Euro-Atlantic space. But instead of tapping into
равных, коллективных началах. Западные страны не только сохранили НАТО, но и вопреки своим клятвенным обещаниям взяли курс на наглое поглощение прилегающего пространства, включая территории, где всегда существовали и будут существовать жизненно важные интересы России. Как докладывал тогдашний госсекретарь США Джим Бейкер президенту Джорджу Бушу-старшему, главная угроза НАТО – это Организация по безопасности и сотрудничеству в Европе. Я бы от себя добавил, что в наши дни и ООН, и требования ее устава тоже представляют угрозу глобальным амбициям Вашингтона. Россия терпеливо пыталась выйти на взаимовыгодные многосторонние договоренности с опорой на принцип неделимости безопасности, который был на высшем уровне, торжественно провозглашен в документах саммитов ОБСЕ и в 1999 году, и в 2010 году. Там черным по белому, прямо и недвусмысленно записано: никто не должен укреплять свою безопасность за счет безопасности других, и никакое государство, группа государств или организация не могут быть наделены преимущественной ответственностью за поддержание мира в регионе ОБСЕ или рассматривать какую-либо часть региона ОБСЕ в качестве сферы своего влияния. НАТО наплевало на эти обязательства президентов и премьеров своих стран и стало действовать ровно наоборот, провозгласив свое право на любой произвол. Кричащий пример беззаконной бомбардировки Югославии в 1999 году, в том числе с применением боезарядов с объединенным ураном, которые впоследствии вызвали всплеск онкологических заболеваний как у сербских граждан, так и у натовских военных. Джо Байден был тогда сенатором и не без гордости говорил на камеру, что лично призывал бомбить Белград и разрушать все мосты на реке Дрини. А теперь посол США в Белграде через средства массовой информации призывает сербов перевернуть страницу и перестать обижаться. Насчет перестать обижаться США накопили богатый опыт. Япония уже давно стыдливо молчит о том, кто же все-таки бомбил Хиросиму и Нагасаки. В школьных учебниках об этом ни слова. Недавно, как вы знаете, на встрече «семерки» Энтони Блинкен пафосно сокрушался о страдании жертв тех бомбардировок, но не сподобился упомянуть о том, кто их организовал. Таковы правила, и никто не смеет перечить. После Второй мировой войны были десятки преступных военных авантюр Вашингтона без каких-либо попыток заручиться многосторонней легитимностью. Зачем, если есть никому неведомые правила? Постыдное вторжение ведомой США коалиции в Ирак в 2003 году было осуществлено в нарушении устава ООН, так же, как и агрессия против Ливии в 2011. Итог – уничтожение государства, сотни тысяч погибших, разгул терроризма. Грубейшим нарушением устава стало вмешательство США в дела постсоветских государств. Были организованы цветные революции в Грузии, Киргизии, кровавый госпереворот в Киеве в феврале 2014 года. В этом же ряду попытки силового захвата власти в Белоруссии в 2020. Англосаксы, уверенно возглавившие весь Запад, не только оправдывают все эти преступные авантюры, но и бравируют своей линией на продвижение демократии. Но опять же по своим правилам. Косово признать независимость без всякого референдума. Крым не признавать, хотя там и был референдум. Фолкленды, Мальвины не трогать, там ведь был референдум, как заявил недавно министр Клевер. Для отказа от двойных стандартов призываем всех руководствоваться консенсусными договоренностями, согласованными в рамках сохраняющей свои силы Декларации ООН 1970 года о принципах международного права. Там четко провозглашена необходимость уважать суверенитет и территориальную целостность тех государств, которые, цитирую, соблюдают принцип равноправия и самоопределения народов и имеют правительство, представляющее весь народ, проживающий на данной территории. Любому беспристрастному наблюдателю очевидно, что нацистский киевский режим никак не может рассматриваться как представляющий жителей территорий, которые отказались принять результаты кровавого госпереворота в феврале 2014 года и против которых за это путчисты развязали войну. точно так же, как Приштина не может претендовать на то, чтобы представлять интересы косовских сербов, которым Евросоюз обещал автономию, так же, как Берлин и Париж обещали специальный статус Донбассу. Результат этих обещаний хорошо известен. Прекрасно сказал наш генеральный секретарь в своем обращении к второму саммиту за демократию 29 марта. Цитирую: «Демократия проистекает из устава ООН, а его первые слова «мы народы» отражают фундаментальный источник легитимной власти, согласие тех, кем управляют. Согласие, подчеркну это еще раз. Чтобы остановить развязанную в результате госпереворота войну на востоке Украины, были предприняты многосторонние усилия в интересах мирного урегулирования, воплотившиеся в резолюцию Совета Безопасности, которая единогласно одобрила Минские договоренности. Эти договоренности были растоптаны Киевом и его западными хозяевами, которые сами недавно цинично, даже с гордостью, признали, что никогда и не собирались
recognize that they never intended to implement this. They simply wanted to gain time to funnel weapons into Ukraine against Russia. In this way, there was a public proclamation of a violation of multilateral obligation of all members of the United Nations, which is enshrined in the Charter, which requires that all members comply with the resolutions of the Security Council. Our subsequent action to prevent confrontation, including President Putin's proposal dating December 2021 for the agreement to be reached on multilateral mutual security guarantees, were high-handedly rejected. Nobody, we were told, can prevent NATO from embracing Ukraine. For all the years after the coup, despite our insistence, nobody, none of Kiev's handlers brought Poroshenko or Zelensky or the Ukrainian upper Rada to their census. Nobody brought them to the census. In the upper Ukrainian Rada, through legislation, the Russian language, Russian education, Russian media outlets, and Russian culture, religious traditions were destroyed in a direct violation of the Ukrainian Constitution, the Universal Convention on the Rights of National Minorities. In parallel, the Kiev regime, through legislation in day-to-day life, introduced Nazi practice and theory without any concealment. Openly, they organized in the center of Kiev and other cities exuberant torch-bearing marches with SS division banners upheld. The West remained silent, and this was fully in line with U.S. plans to leverage the openly racist regime in the hope of weakening the Russian Federation in a strategic focus on eliminating competitors. It is clear to all, even though not everybody talks about this, it's not at all about Ukraine. It's about how international relations will continue to be shaped through the establishment of a sound consensus on the basis of balance of interests, or through aggressive and volatile advancement of Washington's hegemony. We cannot consider the Ukrainian issue separately from the geopolitical context. Multilateralism provides for respect for the United Nations Charter and all of its interlinkage of its principles, and this was mentioned above. The Russian Federation has clearly announced the goals which we are pursuing through the special military operation to eradicate the threats to our security, which were created for years by NATO representatives directly on our borders, and to protect people who have been deprived of the rights proclaimed through multilateral conventions, to protect them from the public statement of a Kiev regime and their actions and direct threats to destroy and expel them from territories where their predecessors lived for centuries. What were the U.S. doing in NATO doing in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya? Were there threats there to their security, their culture, their religions, their languages? What were the multilateral norms that they guided them in their proclamations of the independence of Kosovo and the violation of the principles of the OSCE to the destruction of the stable economically stable states of Iraq and Libya, which collapsed as a result of their actions, and those places were located thousands of miles from U.S. shores. The multilateral system was a blatant attempt of the U.S. and there is a clear imbalance in the UN Secretariat and the UN as a whole. And this is now seen in the staff who are now taking liberties with politically motivated conduct that is not befitting of international civil servants. We urge the Secretary General to ensure that all of his staff comply with impartiality in line with Article 100 of the UN Charter. We also urge the Secretariat leadership in drafting documents on the common agenda, which was mentioned here, the new agenda for peace, which was mentioned here, to be guided by the need to suggest to member states ways to find a balance of interests, rather than helping to advance neoliberal concepts. Otherwise, instead of a multilateral agenda, there will be a deepening of a division between the golden billion and the international majority. Speaking of multilateralism, we cannot be limited to the international context as a whole. Just when we talk about democracy, the international context cannot be disregarded. Double standards need to be abandoned, and multilateralism and democracy need to be respected within states and in their relations with one another. Everybody knows that the West, in imposing their understanding of democracy on others, does not want to see democratization of international relations on the basis of respect for sovereign equality of states, but now advancing their rules on the international arena. They are increasingly asphyxiating multilateralism and democracy at home, applying increasingly repressive tools for suppressing any dissent, as their criminal Kyiv regime has done with the support of its teachers, the U.S. and allies. Distinguished colleagues, as was the case in the Cold War, we have reached the dangerous, possibly even more dangerous threshold. The situation is worsened with the loss of trust in multilateralism, when the financial, economic aggression of the West is destroying the benefits of globalization, when the United States and its allies are abandoning diplomacy and demanding clarification of relations on the battlefield. And this is all done in the halls of the United Nations, which was created to prevent the horrors of war. The voices of wisdom are undermined, and they're calling for the revival of culture of dialogue, and they are muzzled by those who decided to undermine the core principles of multilateral relations. We all need to return to the source, respect for the purposes and principles of the UN Charter in all the diversity and interlinkages. Genuine multilateralism on the international stage at present necessitates adaptation of the United Nations to reflect the trends of the establishment of multilateral architecture of international relations. There's a need to expedite reform of the Security Council to enhance representation of Asian, African, Latin American countries. The current excessive, overwhelming representation of the West in this body undermines the principle of multilateralism. Venezuela's initiative, the Group of Friends for Protection of the UN Charter, was established. We urge all states respecting the Charter to join this. There's an important need to tap into the potential of BRICS, SCO, Eurosec, CIS, STO, and of course, we are in favor of actively leveraging the initiative and positions of regional associations of countries of the Global South. An important role in supporting multilateralism can be played by the G20 if Western participants stop diverting the attention of colleagues from pressing matters on its agenda in their attempt to conceal their own culpability for the accumulation of crises in the global economy. Our common obligation is to preserve the United Nations as the tried and tested beacon for multilateralism and coordination of international policies and politics. The key to success is concerted efforts, abandonment of claims for any exceptionalism, and I repeat this once again, respect for sovereign equality of states. This is what we all signed on to when we ratified the Charter of the United Nations. In 2021, President Putin proposed the establishment of a summit. The summit convened for permanent members of the Security Council. The leaders of China and France supported this initiative. However, unfortunately, this was not realized. This is directly related to multilateralism, not because the 5 permanent members have certain privileges as compared to the others, but specifically due to their particular responsibility under the Charter of the United Nations for the maintenance of international peace and security. And this is specifically what is required now under the imperatives of the UN-centric system, which as a result of the actions of the West is evaporating before our very eyes. Concerns about the situation are increasingly prevalent in the multilateral initiatives and ideas of global South countries, from the East and from East, Southeast Asia, from the Arab, Muslim world as a general, and Africa, Latin America. We value their intention to focus on concerted efforts for the maintenance of a balance of interests on the basis of the sovereign equality of states and indivisibility of security. And to conclude, I wish to turn to all journalists who are now covering today's meeting. Your colleagues from Russian media outlets were not allowed access here. The United States embassy in Moscow mockingly announced willingness to issue visas when our plane took off. So I insist that you compensate for the loss of the presence of Russian journalists. Try to make your reporting objective so that the international community has a genuinely multilateral objective overview in your assessments and the facts provided. I now return to my duties as the President of the Security Council, and I give the floor to Mr. Khalifa Shaheen Al-Marar, Minister of State of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس أود بداية أن أشكركم معالي الوزير سيرجي لافروف على ترأسكم هذا الاجتماع كما أشكر الأمين العام على إحاطته القيمة. سيد الرئيس أن الالتزامنا الراسخ بتعزيز فعالية العمل متعدد الأطراف والقائم على احترام القانون الدولي ومبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة يعد مسألة بالغة الأهمية لصون السلم والأمن الدوليين. وبالتالي فإن الدفاع عن مبادئ هذا الميثاق يأتي في صميم الحفاظ على فعالية العمل متعدد الأطراف. فهذه المبادئ ومن احترام سيادة جميع الدول وحل النزاعات عبر الوسائل السلمية والامتناع عن التهديد باستخدام القوة أو استخدامها ضد السلام الإقليمي والاستقلال السياسي لأي دولة تعد جميعها جوهرية لتمكين الأمم المتحدة من اتخاذ تدابير فعالة تتسق مع الميثاق. وتكتسي هذه المسألة أهمية بالغة في ظل التحديات الجسيمة التي يجابهها عالمنا اليوم، إذ نشهد أعلى معدل سجل للنزاعات المسلحة منذ عام 1945 فضلا عن وصول أعداد النازحين قسريا إلى مستويات غير مسبوقة. وبينما نجد لكبح ارتفاع درجة حرارة الأرض عند مستوى 1.5 درجة مئوية، تواجه الجهود الدولية صعوبات جمة لمكافحة التهديدات المتنامية للتطرف والإرهاب. إن مواجهة هذه التهديدات والتحديات المشتركة يحتم علينا تعزيز الحوار والتعاون بين الدول ومضاعفة الجهود للتوصل إلى حلول سلمية للنزاعات والأزمات امتدادا من أوكرانيا إلى السودان. ونرى في هذا السياق النقاط الثلاث التالية لها بالغ الأثر في تعزيز قدرة العمل متعدد الأطراف على تحسين حياة الشعوب. أولا، يجب أن يخدم العمل متعدد الأطراف جميع الدول الأعضاء في الأمم المتحدة والتي تمثل حقوق وتطوعات 8 مليارات شخص. يجب أن تظل هذه الحقيقة في صلب وصدارة أعمالنا، ولكن غالبا ما يعجز النظام متعدد الأطراف وآلياته عن العمل بفاعلية بسبب ما نشهده من استقطاب دولي وتنافس على المصالح. كما تواصل بعض الدول الأعضاء ممارسة نفوذها على النظام متعدد الأطراف، ويشمل ذلك تأثيرها المفرط في كيفية تشكيل هذه الأنظمة وتحديد متى تعمل لمصلحة الجميع ومتى تكون عاجزة عن ذلك. وهي نفسها الدول التي يمكنها منع أو إجراء الإصلاحات اللازمة لجعل العمل متعدد الأطراف أكثر فاعلية. لقد أصبحت المؤسسات والهياكل الدولية بوضعها الحالي غير قادرة على تمكيننا من تجاوز التحديات القائمة، الأمر الذي يستدعي إصلاح الآليات متعددة الأطراف بدءا من مجلس الأمن ووصولا إلى مؤسسات مثل البنك الدولي وصندوق النقد الدولي، بحيث نعزز شرعيتها ونضمن وجود تمثيل كاف فيها. ومن المهم عند اتخاذ القرارات إشراك الدول الأكثر عرضة للتحديات في المناقشات ذات الصلة. وعدم الاكتفاء بمراعاة شواغلها. ونرى على سبيل المثال أن المناقشات الجديدة حول إصلاح المؤسسات المالية الدولية لتدعم دول الجنوب بشكل أفضل من التطورات المشجعة التي نامل أن تشق مسارا نحو تعزيز المساواة بين الشعوب وإحلال الاستقرار حول العالم. ثانيا، يجب حماية المنافع المشتركة دوليا ووضعها في قائمة أولوياتنا. فأفضل استثمار يمكننا القيام به لصالح شعوبنا وكوكبنا يكمن في تسوية النزاعات سلميا وتعزيز الأمن البشري وابتكار حلول جماعية وإن كانت جزئية للتصدي للتهديدات الجسيمة التي تواجهها البشرية. لقد شهدنا مؤخرا إطلاق عددا من المبادرات البناءة التي تظهر قدرتنا على التعاون معا لاستشراف المستقبل، ولكن يجب أن تصبح مثل هذه المبادرات بمثابة الواقع الجديد وألا تكون مجرد أمثلة فريدة. ونرى هنا أن الاتفاقية المتعددة الأطراف التاريخية لحماية أعالي البحار وقبلها اتفاق باريس تعد أمثلة بارزة على الإنجازات التي يمكن أن يحققها العمل متعدد الأطراف لبناء مستقبل أفضل لشعوبنا. وأخيرا، لا يجب التعامل مع العمل متعدد الأطراف كمجرد عملية دولية مشتركة بين الحكومات، إذ يجب الأخذ بوجهات نظر جميع الجهات الفاعلة ومنها الشباب والنساء في المناقشات التي تجري على مستوى العمل متعدد الأطراف. كما ساهمت الشراكات بين القطاعين العام والخاص في دولة الإمارات خلال فترة الوباء، مثل شركة موانئ دبي العالمية والمدينة العالمية للخدمات الإنسانية، في دعم الجهود متعددة الأطراف لضمان توزيع المعدات الطبية واللقاحات كوفيد-19 حول العالم. وبصفتنا الرئيس المقبل للدورة 28 لمؤتمر الأطراف المعني بتغير المناخ، فإننا نؤمن بأن مشاركة كافة الجهات المعنية وخاصة الدول الأكثر عرضة لتداعياته تشكل ركيزة أساسية لنجاح العمل المناخي. ولهذا نحن حريصون على الأخذ بوجهات نظر النساء والشباب والسكان الأصليين والأوساط العلمية والأكاديمية وقطاع الأعمال التجارية في جميع مخرجات مؤتمر الأطراف. وختاما السيد الرئيس، نشدد بأن إحلال السلام والاستقرار والازدهار لكافة الشعوب والدول لن يكون ممكنا دون العمل معا. الأمر الذي يجعل من إصلاح النظام متعدد الأطراف مسألة ملحة لتلبية تطلعات هذه الشعوب. وشكرا.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Аль-Марара за его заявление и предоставляю слово его превосходительству господину Эрману Имонгу, заместителю министра иностранных дел Габона.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Je félicite la Russie pour l'initiative de cet important débat consacré aux moyens de rendre le multilatéralisme plus efficace et remercie le secrétaire général d'en avoir parfaitement circonscrit les enjeux et la portée. Notre débat intervient une semaine après la publication du rapport du Comité consultatif pour une réforme efficace du multilatéralisme. Les recommandations préconisées par l'éminent panel désigné par le secrétaire général confortent notre volonté de raffermir les fondements du vivre ensemble de la communauté internationale pour une plus grande solidarité internationale qui soit le socle de la sécurité et de la dignité des générations présentes et futures. Cette quête de solidarité internationale est la matrice de la Charte des Nations Unies. En y souscrivant, chacun des membres de l'Organisation des Nations Unies a fait le choix d'une sécurité indivisible. Par l'adhésion aux Nations Unies, chacune des nations du monde a rejeté la logique des nations désunies, des nations stratifiées ou superposées les unes sur les autres. Un choix manifeste dès le préambule de la Charte des Nations Unies où nous nous présentons, nous les peuples du monde, en tant que maillons d'une même chaîne, celle de l'humanité. C'est cet esprit qui devrait non seulement rester au centre de notre système de sécurité collective, mais aussi sédimenter notre projection du développement durable et de la prospérité partagée. L'approche idéale qui porte l'humanité vers son destin commun est l'approche multilatérale. Le multilatéralisme est cette dynamique inclusive de gouvernance globale fondée sur le respect et la prise en compte du narratif de chaque nation, parce que chaque nation compte, parce que chaque peuple compte, parce que chaque vie compte. Nos différences de calibre, d'envergure ou d'appartenance constituent les indispensables déterminants complémentaires qui non seulement nous définissent, mais aussi et surtout nous confèrent toute notre pertinence et notre viabilité au sein du concert des nations. Notre interdépendance et notre communauté de destin nous sont rappelés constamment par les pandémies, les fluctuations économiques, le réchauffement de la planète et j'en passe. Nos principales menaces, plus que jamais transnationales et transfrontalières. Monsieur le Président, pour relever les défis à venir, notre architecture de sécurité devrait être le reflet des réalités actuelles. Nous devons effectuer une mise à jour de nos institutions internationales, de nos mentalités, de nos perceptions d'une paix durable, d'une prospérité partagée et du vivre ensemble. Nous devons réinventer les solutions aux menaces contemporaines, notamment le changement climatique et l'insécurité chronique des États fragiles. Nous devons faire face à la crise de la solidarité internationale qui alimente des crises sous-jacentes sur le plan économique, humanitaire, sanitaire ou alimentaire. Nous ne pouvons assurément pas relever les défis de ce siècle avec les outils d'un autre siècle. Monsieur le Président, un continent tel que l'Afrique, le deuxième continent le plus peuplé, dont on estime qu'il représentera au moins un quart de la population mondiale d'ici 2050 et qui polarise aujourd'hui près de 70% de l'ordre du jour du Conseil de sécurité, n'a hélas pas de siège permanent au sein de cet organe de décision, au sein duquel son destin sécuritaire est scellé. Faisons trêve de constats affligeants et venons-en aux propositions concrètes. Premièrement, nous devons réformer le Conseil de sécurité sans plus tarder, afin qu'il soit représentatif de la réalité d'aujourd'hui et à même de répondre efficacement aux défis actuels et futurs. Naturellement, en tant qu'Africain, j'espère que cette réforme donnera la priorité à la position commune africaine et de sa légitime revendication telle qu'elle se reflète dans le consensus des Unis et la déclaration du 7. Il est clair que l'Afrique n'attendra pas indéfiniment les convulsions d'un processus intergouvernemental de réforme qui, aux yeux de nos peuples, apparaît aujourd'hui comme une interminable distraction. À cet égard, je fais écho aux paroles de son Excellence Ali Bongo Ondimba, président de la République gabonaise, chef d'État, à la tribune de l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies en septembre dernier, qui a martelé que l'Afrique n'attendra plus. Il est temps que cette inacceptable injustice au détriment de l'Afrique soit réparée. Nous comptons d'ailleurs soumettre incessamment à la masse critique africaine nos réflexions d'action sur cette problématique. Deuxièmement, nous devons redéfinir nos règles et nos mécanismes pour faire face de manière adéquate à l'évolution de l'insécurité et du terrorisme. En ce qui concerne les règles, nous devons garantir l'inclusivité et la solidarité et ne laisser aucune place ni à la politique du deux poids deux mesures, ni à la solidarité à géométrie variable. De plus, il importe que nous nous attaquions résolument aux causes profondes des conflits et des crises. Troisièmement, nous devons construire un nouveau contrat social, un nouveau pacte mondial entre les générations, entre les gouvernants et les gouvernés, entre l'échelle mondiale et régionale, en mettant un accent particulier sur les conditions des jeunes et des femmes. Dans ce nouveau contrat social pour l'avenir, les passerelles doivent en tout lieu remplacer les murs. L'éducation doit partout repousser le carcan de l'ignorance et de l'intolérance. Le multilatéralisme doit prévaloir sur les postures unilatéralistes et la logique du dialogue doit sans cesse prévaloir sur celle de l'antagonisme. Il est illusoire de penser que l'humanité survivra avec des bulles de sécurité et de prospérité entourées d'un océan d'insécurité et de misère. S'il en était ainsi, l'inévitable alternative à la paix et à la prospérité pour tous serait fatalement la mise en danger de tous et la déchéance collective. Nous devons en priorité dresser un bouclier d'action et d'initiative pour se prémunir et s'interdire entre les nations du monde toute prédation de ressources, toute prédation de dignité, afin de restituer au peuple du monde leurs aspirations à la sécurité, à la prospérité et à une plus grande liberté. Monsieur le Président, pour terminer, je voudrais souligner la nécessité de s'affranchir de toute défiance ou déviation vis-à-vis du multilatéralisme. Aussi vrai que plusieurs monologues ne fassent pas un dialogue, la multiplicité de relations bilatérales n'aura jamais l'effet et encore moins les vertus de la concertation multilatérale. reduce the
Le
effect, or far less
multibilatéralisme
have the virtues
mène à la
of multilateral
fragmentation,
cooperation.
à la division du monde en blocs,
Multilateralism leads to
tandis que la vocation
fragmentation.
du
It divides the world
multilatéralisme
into
est
blocks.
de mener à
In
l'unité
contrast, the
et à la
vocation
construction
of
de passerelles
multilateralism
entre
is to
nous,
build
les peuples du
unity and
monde.
bridges between we, the
Nous devons des
peoples of the
réponses aux
world.
générations
We owe
présentes et
responses
futures
to current
qui
and
soient à la
future
dimension de
generations
leurs
which are
légitimes
commensurate
aspirations
with
à
their
vivre en
legitimate
sécurité,
aspirations to
en
live
paix
in
et dans une
security,
plus grande
peace,
dignité.
and in greater
Ces
dignity.
réponses
These
sont à portée de
responses
main.
are within our grasp.
Ces réponses
These
ne
responses
peuvent plus
cannot
et ne doivent
wait
plus
and
attendre.
must wait no
Je vous
longer.
remercie.
Thank you.
Благодарю его
I
превосходительство
thank
господина
His
Имонго за
Excellency
его
Mr.
заявление и предоставляю слово его
Mongol for his
превосходительству
statement, and I'll
господину
give the
Томасу
floor to His
Мбомбе,
Excellency Mr. Thomas
заместителю министра
Mbomba,
иностранных дел и
Deputy
региональной
Minister for Foreign
интеграции
Affairs
Ганы.
and Regional Integration of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellency, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, let me begin by congratulating you and the delegation of Russia for your presidency of the Security Council for the month of April. We also welcome the participation in this meeting of the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, and thank him for his insightful remarks. As I make these remarks, let me also indicate that we associate ourselves with the statement that will be delivered later by the representative of the Republic of Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement. The multilateral system that was fashioned out of the ashes of the Second World War has no doubt been the cornerstone, with some exceptions, for relative peace, security, and development across the world. Adherence to the principles in the United Nations Charter, including the sovereign equality of states and the prohibition of the use of force, has been an underpinning pillar for the global stability. Disinformation, migration, crisis, food and energy insecurity, the world has never faced a more profound crisis since the World War or Cold War. Structural impairment, including the debilitating impact of the veto system in the Security Council, the chronic lack of financing for development, a rise in geopolitical competition, and a decline in international cooperation have helped our effort to renew global institutions and deepen multilateralism. In the face of an easy weakness to reject or undermine shared normative values and principles for collaboration and collective action, we risk relapsing into a New Hebrean state of nature. It is not too late to seek a way out of the increasingly confrontational politics, zero-sum games, and egoistic, chaotic, and brutish tendencies of recent years. It is in the interest of the states, whether small or mighty, to safeguard the multilateral system, since the agreed international rules and institutions allow all voices to be heard and the ability to influence the international order in less costly and more sustainable way. Ghana, therefore, welcomes the focus of today's debate, which provides us with an opportunity to deliberate on ways that we can defend the UN Charter and promote it towards an effective multilateral system. Mr. President, in considering how we can enhance an effectively rule-based multilateral system through the defense of the UN Charter, Ghana will share 5 main points. First, while it is important to reaffirm our respective commitment to the purpose and principles of the UN Charter, it is equally pertinent that we embark on practical steps to enhance our responsiveness to the demand of the UN, of the Charter. In this regard, we urge the prioritization of the enhanced, inclusive, and multi-stakeholder approach that enable all actors to adhere to the norms and values in the Charter. This, in our view, should be devoid of politicization as well as any form of selectivity in application. We cannot overemphasize the importance for member states to embrace a principled approach underpinned by a common understanding and good faith interpretation in the application of the provisions of the Charter. We must also prioritize the will of the people of the world if we are to achieve a smooth transition to a fair and equitable global world order. The cynicism which some countries display in the twisting principle or bending them to their will may bring short-term tendencies advantages. History shows those gains are ephemeral. Secondly, a candid recognition of the realities of our time should spur us all to embrace deliberate diplomatic actions to build mutual trust consistent with the diplomatic conventions. As my compatriot Kofi Annan once said, our futures, our prosperity and security are wrapped up together more than ever before. No country, no matter how wealthy or powerful, can any longer stand on its own. This reality should lead us to build bridges, not burn them, and lay solid foundations for dialogue and consensus, including using dialogue to objectively discuss the strategic intentions of countries. This remains critical for avoiding misjudgment and unhealthy competition, especially among majority of major military powers. Within this context, it is also important that we address the structural impairment in the multilateral system through a faithful and genuine effort in the ongoing reform initiative in the UN system, including the revitalization of the General Assembly and the reform of the Security Council. As an African member state, we have stated our position and justified our argument. Those who support a strengthened bilateral system has a responsibility to reciprocate and work constructively and urgently in good faith to address with us the historical injustice done the African continent, which is also one of the weaknesses in multilateral structure. Thirdly, the multilateral system should be turbocharged through an effective implementation of our objectives with regional arrangements that share similar objectives. We must therefore enhance implementation of Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, especially around regional prevention. The United Nations has its strength, but when it is unable to act, the strength of regional actors must be embraced. For instance, we cannot attempt a legitimate resolution of the crisis of terrorism on the African continent without the collaboration of institutions of the African Union and the regional economic communities, such as ECOWAS, as well as the Accra Initiative in the Sahel. It is also only fair that when such regional bodies stand up and offer to act, their burden should be shared with the principal body that owns that primary duty. Fourthly, prevailing global challenges are so interconnected and multidimensional that we need to enhance collaboration and joint consultation among different institutions and drive coherence to avoid negative and adverse consequences from global politics. This requires, we believe, an enhancement of consultation with institutions and processes outside the UN system, such as Bretton Woods institutions, but also as appropriate with relevant civil society organizations and responsible private sector actors to adequately address pressing needs of the peoples of the world, especially those of the developing world. This is important because when there are global crises, such as the prevailing financial and food crisis, we should know that further down the road, there will be greater manifestation of socio-political instability, diminished capacity for conflict management, and further conflicts. Lastly, Mr. President, we believe that the Secretary General's report on our common agenda, including the new agenda for peace, provide us with a forward-looking vision for reinvigorated, inclusive, and effective multilateralism to tackle contemporary global challenges. The initiative can lay the grounds for effective multilateralism if they prioritize investment in intervention aimed at addressing existing and emerging risks, including those associated with nuclear weapons and the disproportionate threats to the countries in the global south. Furthermore, enhancing the convening power of the UN in tackling the multifaceted crises, including climate threats, gender inequality in all its forms, and involving women and youth in peace processes are all germane to strengthen the responsiveness of the multilateral system. In conclusion, Mr. President, Ghana believes that the tools available in the UN Charter remain indispensable in addressing existing and emerging challenges of our time. What is required is to strategically harness and effectively deploy these tools, including Chapter 6 of the peaceful settlement of disputes. Ultimately, the demonstration of stronger political will by all member states, including this Council, is essential if we are to make meaningful progress in the defense of the UN Charter. I thank you.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Бомбу и предоставляю слово представителю Швейцарии.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his statement. I wish first and foremost to convey our concerns in the light of the violence which is currently raging in Sudan, which has unacceptably been affecting the civilian population. Switzerland joins the call of the Secretary General. The adoption of the Charter of the United Nations on 26 June 1945 signified a fundamental paradigm shift. War, once a legitimate means of a foreign policy, was now prohibited. Territorial expansion by force, previously the privilege of the great military powers, was outlawed. The prohibition of the use of force, coupled with the obligation to resolve conflicts peacefully, was revolutionary. These principles placed countries of all sizes and of all powers on an equal legal footing, or almost. The privileges of the great powers were intensely debated already in San Francisco, and finally accepted on condition of a clear promise, greater responsibility for the permanent members of the Security Council for the maintenance of international peace and security. As member states, we have all subscribed to the principles and values enshrined in the Charter. We reaffirmed this commitment in an excellent declaration on the occasion of the United Nations 75th anniversary. Yet the Charter is being violated on a massive scale. State sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force continue to be flouted. And this has been the case for more than a year by the military aggression of a permanent member of the Security Council against its neighbor. The most effective way to safeguard multilateralism and the integrity of the United Nations Charter is therefore to respect it. Switzerland emphatically condemns the military aggression against Ukraine, and we reiterate our firm call on the Russian Federation to without delay, withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine. This open debate is presented as an opportunity for the Security Council to demonstrate its commitment to the Charter and to discuss the strengthening of multilateralism. This is a duty that we have, not just today, but a duty which we shoulder each time we call for the protection of civilians, every time we condemn violations of international law, and every time we urge the parties to conflict to silence their weapons and to return to the negotiating table. This is a duty we have under the Geneva Conventions, a success of multilateralism, because the Geneva Conventions are among the few international treaties that have been universally ratified. As the conventions commemorate as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the conventions next year, it is incumbent upon states to take concrete steps to strengthen respect for international humanitarian law. This is a duty in times of peace as well as in times of war, to respect human rights that serve to protect human dignity. The 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this year will be an opportunity to reaffirm its universality. Switzerland firmly believes that effective multilateralism remains the only way to achieve the vision of a peaceful and just world, a world where the rule of law prevails and not the law of the strongest, a world where human dignity is always respected, a world in which finally the entire population benefits from both social and economic progress. We are convinced of this because respect for the Charter remains existential for a small or medium-sized state like ours, as well as for most member states of the United Nations, regardless of whether this world is unipolar, bipolar,
Nous en sommes également convaincus parce que la Charte et le multilatéralisme ont permis à l'humanité de faire des progrès remarquables, comme d'éviter à ce jour une confrontation nucléaire, de décoloniser nombreuses régions du monde, de réduire la pauvreté, d'améliorer l'accès aux systèmes de santé et d'éducation, de progresser économiquement et même de marcher sur la Lune et créer une intelligence artificielle. Nous avons réussi, dans cette enceinte, à négocier les buts du développement durable et de l'agenda 23 qui, si nous les mettons enfin pleinement en œuvre, peuvent sauver cette planète et créer plus d'égalité pour nos enfants et nos petits-enfants. Force est de constater que l'efficacité de la Charte fonctionne selon la volonté des États de la mettre en œuvre. Et cette volonté fait trop souvent défaut. Nous vivons une période de polycrise. L'ONU estime qu'un ou une jeune sur 4 est touché par la violence ou les conflits armés, que ce soit une fille sous les frappes aériennes à Khartoum, Bakhmout ou Sagaïm, livrée à la violence sexuelle à Port-au-Prince ou à Goma, ou privée d'éducation à Kandahar. Les principes de la Charte ne sont pas un menu à choix. Nous appelons au respect inconditionnel du droit international par tous les acteurs en toutes circonstances. Et nous appelons au courage pour enfin sérieusement engager des réformes du système multilatéral, y compris de ce Conseil, afin de rétablir la confiance dans et au sein de ce système. Avec notre programme commun et le nouvel agenda pour la paix, nous avons une chance unique, mais aussi une nécessité urgente. Nous devons rapidement changer le cours de l'histoire. Avec du leadership, de la volonté politique et de la confiance, nous pouvons y parvenir. L'histoire jugera si nous avons respecté la Charte. On peut nier les faits, utiliser une rhétorique cynique ou diffuser de la désinformation, mais on ne peut pas tromper la mémoire de l'histoire. Elle nous jugera. Et la famille humaine ne pourra pas guérir avant que justice soit faite aux victimes et que la confiance soit rétablie. C'est aussi la toute première recommandation du rapport présenté par le Conseil consultatif sur le multilatéralisme efficace la semaine passée. Recréer la confiance par l'inclusion et la responsabilité. Cette confiance exige que nous nous écoutions les uns les autres. Menons un dialogue sur ce qui nous unit, un dialogue constructif plutôt que des discussions sur le nombre de pôles de ce monde. Un dialogue pour rappeler le respect des principes universels auxquels nous avons souscrit. Il n'y a pas d'alternative à un multilatéralisme efficace. Un multilatéralisme universel, inclusif et fondé sur le droit international. Je vous remercie.
Я благодарю
I thank the representative of Switzerland, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Russian Federation for organizing this debate, and I thank the Secretary General for his intervention. Mr. President, in these challenging times, we should reinforce our commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, to international law, and to multilateralism. As members of the Security Council, we have a particular responsibility in preserving the principles and values based on which the multilateral system has been collectively built over nearly 8 decades. The conflict in Ukraine has added enormous stress to the multilateral system, which was already subject to new challenges and growing dissent. The failure of this Council to effectively deal with yet another war falls short of member states' expectations on its primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, and eventually ends up eroding its credibility. The international community has already proven to be able to adapt and evolve in several areas, except in peace and security. For example, back in 2008, after the global financial crisis, a group of countries decided to establish the G20, which proved to be a valuable framework for addressing new economic and financial challenges. Besides its deficiencies, such as a limited representation of African countries, it has since come to be one of the most representative bodies in the international community. The Brazilian position on the Council on Reform is known to all. We believe that its current composition, which reflects the balance of power in 1945, is not compatible with the current geopolitical realities. The African continent and our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, are not represented in the category of permanent members. This results in the increasing lack of legitimacy of this body to take decisions on the peace and security agenda, and underscores the sense of frustration which the shortcomings of the UN system as a whole. Mr. President, this is not, however, the only cause of the situation in which we find ourselves. In addition to structural flaws of this Council, we cannot help but notice a lesser disposition to engage in dialogue and diplomacy, in contradiction with the spirit of the San Francisco Conference. Since the beginning of our current mandate as an elected member of the Council, there have been many occasions when the demand for sanctions has been the knee-jerk reaction to crisis situations. In most cases, these initiatives were preceded by unilateral coercive measures, illegal under international law and ineffective. In our discussions, due consideration is rarely given to the spin-off effects on third countries, especially those which already face strong economic, social, and institutional challenges and their most vulnerable populations. Brazil rejects the pursuit of hegemonies, old or new. In line with Article 2, Para 4 of the Charter, we condemn the threat or use of force as means of resolving disputes, as we have seen in the case of Ukraine. We also condemn more subtle attempts to impose the will of the few on the many, on the basis of concepts of dubious multilateral standing. We refute world conceptions based on simplistic divisions that fail to reflect the complexity of reality, an approach that does not benefit the vast majority of member states and only serves to sow division among nations. We defend, in fact, a return to the principles on which this organization bases its very existence, enshrined in the UN Charter, with increased emphasis on peaceful means to end conflicts. As a founding member of this organization, we have never and will never condone violations of member states' territorial integrity. We should not give up on diplomacy and should rather seek solutions collectively to address the challenges of our times. Diplomacy and peace are the means and the purpose of the Security Council. We must not shy away from this responsibility. Mr. President, the world is going through a moment of international order redesign. In our view, we are heading to some sort of multipolar order that should be welcomed and nurtured, since it will benefit the whole of the international community. We are aware of the many shortcomings of the UN system, but we continue to trust the centrality of the United Nations and its role in preserving peace and finding solutions to common challenges. Brazil believes in the strength of the multilateral approach on issues such as climate emergency and on development needs, respecting the diversity of points of view and national positions. It is essential, however, that we engage in an earnest debate about the need for a renewed multilateralism, in particular in the field of peace and security, setting aside practices that will only deepen divisions instead of contributing to a more peaceful world. And I thank you.
Я благодарю
I
представителя
thank the
Бразилии и
representative of
предоставляю
Brazil,
слово
and I give the floor to the
представителю Мозамбика.
representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to reiterate our hearty congratulations to Russia's assumption of the presidency of the Security Council. We are delighted to see you presiding over this session. We warmly welcome the initiative by the Russian Federation of convening this open debate under the theme. We express our gratitude to the Secretary General of the United Nations for his important briefing. Mr. President, it is universally recognized that the creation of the United Nations represented a new departure in the human attitude towards mutual cooperation for peace and security. The Charter, signed on 26 June 1945, in the aftermath of the bloody and tragic Second World War, clearly affirmed the importance of multilateralism. It proclaimed unambiguously in the treaty the will and determination of we, the peoples of the United Nations. Furthermore, in laying out the purpose of the organization, the Charter listed 4, but the last one summed them all and was framed as follows, and I quote, "To be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common goals." This was, in our view, the birth of a new multilateralism that guides the modern-day interaction between states and nations. And it is our conviction that the overriding purpose of this multilateralism is to fulfill the purposes of the United Nations, chief among them the maintenance of international peace and security. This resembles very much what someone someday said: war appears to be as old as mankind, but peace is a modern invention. As a matter of fact, it also resonates with Article 2, Paragraph 4 of our Charter. This is a new approach to war in its nature, an invention of the Charter that we accepted to abide by. It is our understanding that within this provision of the Charter, the founding mission of the United Nations was to provide all its member states with a solid ground of equal security. Our organization would thus become a forum where we could work together to resolve disputes peacefully and to prevent the outbreak of another world war. In sum, the Charter proclaimed the overriding importance of collective security. In this context, equal and indivisible security of states is at the core of collective security that the Charter consecrated in its letter and spirit. The collective security means that the security of one is the security of all, and that the security in our globalized world is also a global concept, a global good that cannot be divided or fragmented. This is why, in our view, Article 51 of the Charter on individual or collective self-defense comes as an exception and a reminder that all states deserve to live in peace and security. In this connection, it is our view that the relations among nations should be based on the respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. As the most representative intergovernmental organization and the utmost expression of multilateralism, the United Nations is the main forum to address multifaceted and complex global challenges through collective action. So any profound divisions among member states can only undermine this important endeavor which the founders of the United Nations undertook to advance in 1945. In this regard, multilateralism, differently and opposed from unilateralism, implies adherence to common principles and objectives founded on respect for a system of shared norms and values and guided by the principles of consultation, inclusion, and solidarity among nations. Mr. President, the current global security challenges, such as interstate wars, interstate conflicts, terrorism, transnational organized crime, proliferation of weapons, limited peacekeeping capacity and financing, divided and competing collective security systems, nuclear disarmament, among others, need a concerted approach with a reinforced role of multilateralism. divisions in our approach to collective security architecture, and mistrust can only undermine dialogue. They hamper our efforts for peaceful settlement of disputes and conflicts. They further weaken the collective resolve of our universal organization to effectively perform its objectives. As Mozambique has stated in this chamber, time and again, peace is a global good. Its preservation requires our concerted efforts. With the positive cooperation of states, we can find concerted and harmonized ways to address most of the current and pressing conflicts around the world, including in Africa, Middle East, Asia, the Korean Peninsula, and even in Europe or beyond. Let us not forget the tragedies of the two world wars that claimed the lives of more than 9 million people in the first and more than 60 million people in the second. We see no reason whatsoever that this should be repeated. But all that we evoked above also bears testimony to the fact that the United Nations, especially the Security Council, must be reformed in order to be more inclusive, effective, just, fair, and democratic. Only in that manner can we collectively address the current geopolitical and security challenges facing the humankind. More importantly, it is a simple corollary of the fundamental principle of sovereign equality of states that the Charter so clearly expounds. We value democracy at national level. It must also be valid at the international level. Therefore, Mozambique reiterates its call on the need for a Security Council reform which should take into account the African common position based on the Zuluin Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. In addition, this council has to improve its working methods. It must enhance its capacity to deliver in the interests of all humankind. This means adopting actions that can bring positive change and promote peace and security around the world. In conclusion, Mr. President, we wish to reiterate that in order for multilateralism to prosper and be more effective, the United Nations and the entire membership must abide by and uphold the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter at all times. Multilateralism must be reinvigorated in the interests of the entire humankind in order to address today's global challenges. Multilateralism is at the core of our Charter's calling. I thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Мозамбика и предоставляю слово представителю Соединенных Штатов.
To the representative of the United States.
Let me start by thanking Secretary General Guterres for your remarks, and to thank you and the entire UN system for all of your efforts to promote peace and security and to support the UN Charter. And thank you, colleagues, for coming together to talk about how we can defend the UN Charter and make multilateralism more effective. This is a serious topic, even if it was convened by a council member whose actions demonstrate a blatant disregard for the UN Charter. At the United Nations, if you ask a difficult policy question, you get 193 different answers. That makes our work challenging, but it is also right, because after all, that is what the UN is all about. Member states can work through disagreements, find common ground, and see where we can make progress together. And there are some things we're not meant to disagree about. There are some values and principles that are so fundamental, so critical to our purpose, that signing on to them is the price of admission to the UN. These are the values laid out in the United Nations Charter, a charter we have all sworn to uphold and to protect. And it is quite clear what those values are. This little blue book is written in plain language, and it spells out our purposes and principles in its very first chapter. And I want to read it to you. Article 1, the purposes of the United Nations are to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems, and promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms. And here in Article 2, it states clearly, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Territorial integrity, respect for human rights, international cooperation. These are our values. These are the shared, stated principles we all agree to uphold, all of us. And it's our belief in them that binds us together. Those principles have been the basis for the UN's greatest triumphs over the past 8 decades. Despite the international system's imperfections, our shared principles have helped us curtail nuclear proliferation, prevent mass atrocities, and forge peace through negotiation and mediation. They have undergirded an international order that has helped us provide humanitarian aid to those in desperate need, to lift over 1 billion people out of poverty, and to prevent another world war. And right now, as much as ever, the world needs an effective UN and effective multilateralism. Challenges like the climate crisis, the global food security crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic are exactly the kinds of borderless challenges we need the UN to tackle. And yet, right when the world needed the UN most, we were plunged into a crisis of confidence. Our hypocritical convener today, Russia, invaded its neighbor, Ukraine, and struck at the heart of the UN Charter and all the values we hold dear. This illegal, unprovoked, and unnecessary war runs directly counter to our most shared principles, that a war of aggression and territorial conquest is never, ever acceptable. And as we sit here, that aggression continues. As we sit here, Russian forces continue to kill and injure civilians. As we sit here, Russian forces are destroying Ukraine's critical infrastructure. As we sit here, we brace ourselves for the next Bucha, the next Mariupol, the next Kherson, the next war crime, the next unconscionable atrocity. 141 UN member states have made it abundantly clear Russia's full-scale invasion was not about self-defense. Russia simply wants to redraw international borders by force in violation of this very UN Charter. And that goes against everything this institution stands for. This does not just concern Ukraine or Europe. It concerns all of us because today it's Ukraine, but tomorrow it could be another country, another small nation that is invaded by its larger neighbor. And what would we want this council to do in response? Sit on our hands? No. It is the very reason the UN Charter was written in the first place. And unfortunately, Russia has shown us consistently over the past 14 months that this invasion is not an isolated incident. In the past 14 months, Russia has weaponized global food supplies and obstructed the Black Sea grain initiatives from achieving its full potential. Russia has breached its obligations under the New START Treaty and issued dangerous and provocative nuclear threats. Russia has violated universal human rights and fundamental freedoms both outside and inside its own borders. It has violated international law. That includes the wrongful detention of American citizens. Paul Whelan, Trevor Reed, Brittany Griner, and now Evan Gershkovich. Trevor and Brittany are now thankfully home, safe and sound. But Russia has imprisoned Paul Whelan and now detaining Evan Gershkovich to use as political bargaining chips, human pawns. Paul was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Evan is a journalist. He was just doing his job. Using people as pawns is a strategy of weakness. These are not the actions of a responsible country. And while Russia plays political games, real people suffer. And I want to direct your attention to the gallery, where today we're joined by Paul's sister, Elizabeth. And I want Minister Lavrov to look into her eyes and see her suffering. I want you to see what it's like to miss your brother for 4 years, to know he is locked up in a Russian penal colony simply because you want to use him for your own means. I'm calling on you right now to release Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich immediately, to let Paul and Evan come home, and to cease this barbaric practice once and for all. Colleagues, while Russia may be undermining the UN Charter and this institution, the rest of us can and must do better. The UN needs reform, you've heard that. To support and maintain its fundamental principles, this body must evolve to meet the 21st century. As part of that evolution, the Security Council needs to better reflect today's global realities. We must find credible, sensible, and politically viable paths to this end. And while we work to forge those paths, those of us on the Security Council have a duty to do more, to do better. As you all know, in San Francisco last year, I announced 6 principles for responsible behavior for Security Council permanent members. These were standards we set for ourselves, that we welcome all to hold us to, that we encourage for other permanent members. Colleagues, the United States believes in the United Nations, and we believe in this charter. And that belief gives us faith that it can be made better still. Our response to Russia's flagrant violations cannot be to abandon this institution's founding principles. Instead, we must recommit to the principles of sovereignty, of territorial integrity, of peace and security, and use those principles as guideposts as we strengthen the United Nations and make it fit for the purposes of the 21st century. We must reform this institution and support efforts such as the Secretary General's ambitious Our Common Agenda initiative to modernize the multilateral system. We must not shirk our responsibilities to address threats by the DPRK to international peace and security. We must forcefully address the situation in Sudan as we heard the call from the Secretary General for peace and a cessation of hostilities. We must use our platform to call out aggression and human rights violations wherever and whenever we see them. We must renew our commitment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, to heal the climate, to end poverty and hunger. That is the brighter future we hope to build. So we must rally behind this UN Charter, take on shared global challenges seriously, do everything in our power to be better neighbors, and together create a more peaceful, more prosperous world for us all. Thank you.
Как вежливый председатель, я, несмотря ни на что, поблагодарю представителя Соединенных Штатов и предоставлю слово представителю Соединенного Королевства.
Thank you. At the outset, let me echo the strong concerns set out by the Secretary General about the situation in Sudan and the call for an immediate end to the violence. We have requested a council meeting to address the situation tomorrow. I join others in thanking the Secretary-General for his briefing. Minister Lavrov has called this meeting to share the Russian vision for the future of multilateralism. We've seen what Russia's idea of multilateralism means for the world. More than a year into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, President Putin has brought unimaginable suffering to that country while trampling on the UN Charter. Thousands of Ukrainians have been killed. Millions have been displaced. And across the world, billions have faced rocketing commodity prices and food insecurity. It's been an unmitigated disaster for Russia too. Neither Russia nor its neighbours feel safer. Trust in Russia's promises to other states and to its own people is at a catastrophic low. Again and again, the UN General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly to condemn Russia's invasion. President Putin can count the supporters of his war on one hand. Russia has severely damaged its reputation in the international community. And now, President Putin is threatening to move nuclear weapons into a neighbouring state. For Russians, the world is getting smaller. Many tens of thousands of Russian men and women have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been mobilized against their will. Millions are fleeing the country to escape the draft. Independent journalists have been arrested. Free speech has been crushed. Russia's economy is shrinking. Its army is in disarray, reliant on Wagner, an unaccountable mercenary group whose existence was denied a year ago, but who now offers your foreign ministry advice on your Security Council presidency. A Russian generation has lost its future, and the Russian government can't even explain why. Russia's justifications for the war defeating Nazis and defending against bioweapons are obvious falsehoods. Russia's claims to Ukraine's territory will never be recognized. For all of Minister Lavrov's claims about effective multilateralism, I see nothing effective or multilateral about Russia's foreign policy. Multilateral institutions can and should evolve, the Security Council included, and the UK supports reforms to make it more effective and representative. Change must be underpinned by respect for the basic principles of the Charter, above all, the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. The world also needs a free and safe Ukraine that can return to supplying the world with food. The UK will continue to stand together with Ukraine as it lawfully defends itself. Foreign Minister Lavrov claims he is as interested in ending the conflict as soon as possible. To do so, Russia must immediately remove its troops from all Ukrainian territory. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Я приглашаю выступить представителя Китайской Народной
representative of the People's Republic of China to take the floor.
谢谢主席先生。
Thank you, Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
我很荣幸
I'm
作为
honored
中国国务
to
委员
speak
兼外长
as the
秦刚先
representative
生的
of
代表
Mr.
发
Qin
言。
Gang, State Counselor and
中
Foreign
方
Minister
赞赏
of
俄罗
China.
斯作为安理会
China
本
thanks
月
Russia
主
as
席
President of
倡
the
议
Security
举行
Council for
此
this
次
month for its
公开辩
initiative
论
to
会。
convene this
欢
open
迎
debate
拉夫罗夫外
and
长
welcomes Foreign
主持
Minister
今天的会议。
Lavrov's presiding over this
我也
meeting.
感谢古特
I
雷斯秘
also
书长
thank
刚
Secretary
才
General Guterres
所做的
for
通报，
his briefing.
也同意他
I
对
also
一
agree
些
with
当前所面临的挑战的一些看法。
his assessment on the
世
current
界正
challenges
站
we are
在
facing.
历史的十字路口，
The world is standing
人类
at
社
a
会面临
historic
前所未
crossroads
有
now.
的
The humanity
全球
is
性挑
facing
战。
unprecedented
霸权霸凌行
global
径给
challenges.
世界带来
Acts of
深重
hegemony
灾
and bullying
危
are
害。
causing colossal
集团
harm
政
to
治
the
正
world.
在制造
Bloc
巨大的分
politics
裂
are
和
creating
对抗，
huge divisions and
维护联合
confrontations.
国宪
It
章
has
的紧
become
迫
all the
性
more urgent
重
and
要性
important to
进一
uphold
步
the
上升。
UN Charter.
当前最重要
What
的
is
是，
most needed
各
now
国践
is
行
for
真
all
正的多边
countries
主
to
义，
practice
在
genuine
联合国体制下
multilateralism,
加强
strengthen
团结，
unity under the banner
提
of the
升
United
全球
Nations,
治理体
enhance
系
the
的有效
effectiveness
性，
of the global governance
实现
system,
共同安全，
achieve common
促进
security,
共同发展，
promote common
开
development,
辟
and open
共
up
同
a
未来。
common future.
第一，必
First,
须坚定
the
捍卫联合国
authority of
宪
the
章的
UN
权
Charter
威。
must be firmly safeguarded.
联合国宪章是
The
战后国际
UN
秩序
Charter
的
is
基
the
石。
cornerstone of the post-war
宪
international
章所确
order.
立的尊重国
The
家主权
principles
和
of
领土完整
respecting sovereignty and territorial
不干涉内
integrity,
政等原
non-interference
则，
of internal
构成了
affairs of
现
other
代国
countries
际关
as
系的
stipulated in
基
the
本准
Charter
则。
have become the basic norms
当今世
governing
界
modern
出现这
international
样那样的
relations.
问题，
The problems that have
不是因
arisen in
为
the
联
world
合国
today
宪章
are
过时
not
了，
because the UN Charter
而
has
恰
become
恰是因为宪
obsolete,
章的宗
but
旨和
because its
原则
purposes and
未
principles have
能
not
得
been
到有效
effectively
的落实。
implemented.
人类
The
今代后世的安危
security and
福祉，
well-being of present
仍
and
有
future
赖于
generations of
宪章精
mankind
神继续
still
得到
depend on
发
the
扬光大，
continued promotion
有
of the
赖于
spirit of the
维护
Charter
联合国的
and
地
on
位
the preservation
和
of
作
the
用，
status and role of the United
捍
Nations.
卫宪章的权威和效
To
力，
safeguard the authority and
不能只
effectiveness
挂在
of the
嘴上，
Charter, we should not
而要
just
见诸
do it
行
in
动。
words, but also in deeds.
不能只
We
要求
must
别人做到，
not just have others do
而要
it,
先
but
从自己做
start
起，
with oneself.
不能
We
搞
must
选
not
择
be
性适用，对自己搞例外主
half-hearted
义，
and
而
do
要
it
慎终如始，
selectively, but
一
do
以
it
贯
all
之。
the time
不
consistently.
能搞排他
We
性小
must not
圈
have
子，
exclusive
制造
clubby
所谓
circles,
民主对
fabricate
抗威权
so-called
的叙事，
democracy
挑起地缘政
confrontation
治对
and
抗，
authoritarian narratives
而要
and
倡导
provoke
对话合作，
geopolitical confrontation,
坚
but
持
advocate
共商共
dialogue
建
and
共享，
cooperation and insist on
以
extensive
和平方
consultation,
式
joint
解
contribution,
决争
and
端。
shared benefits and resolve disputes by peaceful means.
Second, we must firmly uphold the international order underpinned by international law. The world has only one order, and that is the international order underpinned by international law. Faced with the big change and chaos in the world today, we must always be guided by the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and base ourselves on international law in handling international affairs. This is an important guarantee for upholding fairness and justice, addressing global challenges, and safeguarding the sovereignty, security, and development interests of all countries. We oppose some countries distorting the meaning of international law, imposing its own will on the international community, packaging it into the so-called rules-based international order, and wantonly violating the legitimate rights of other countries in violation of law, international rule of law. We also oppose the belittling of international agreements, whether it is arbitrarily tearing them up or having double standards. There is no credibility to speak of in this regard. If a major power arbitrarily turns important treaties and agreements that bear on international peace and security into dead letter, then not only will international law be eroded, but the world will have no peace at all. In this regard, the relevant country should earnestly reflect its action. Third, it is necessary to ensure equal participation of all countries in international affairs. The international system, with the UN at its core, carries the common expectations of the world's peoples and should serve the interests of all countries. The United Nations cannot and should not serve the interests of only some countries or even a few countries. It is unreasonable for citizens of one country to head some specialized UN agencies and international financial institutions on a long-term or even permanent basis. The big change of the world is accelerating. The multipolar world is becoming a reality. The pace of democracy in international relations must also keep up to truly reflect equality and enhance the equity and effectiveness of multilateralism. Developing countries, and African countries in particular, deserve to play a greater role in the United Nations. The right of developing countries to participation and decision-making must be ensured. We support the initiative of Secretary-General Guterres to reform the international financial institutions, and we must act immediately to improve the global governance system. Fourth, unilateral sanctions that violate international law must be resisted. Unilateral sanctions indiscriminately imposed by the United States and other countries outside the Council mandate are entirely for maintaining their hegemony, technological monopoly, and ideology. Their practice has no legal basis. This stands in sharp contrast to the development and progress of the world. Unilateral sanctions are like a rampaging monster, constantly creating and aggravating humanitarian crises, violating the basic rights of women and children, hindering the development and progress of countries, especially small and medium-sized countries, and causing immense damage to the harmony and stability of international relations. What is of greater concern is that unilateral sanctions, often in the name of upholding international law and implementing Council resolutions, have subjected the United Nations to unfounded accusations and weakened its authority for multilateralism. We once again urge the relevant countries to immediately stop
unilateral sanctions and call on the international community and all countries to uphold fairness and justice and independence and jointly resist and counteract such illegal acts. Mr. President, as a permanent member of the Security Council and a responsible large country, China adheres to genuine multilateralism all the time. In complying with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and in complying with international law and basic norms governing international relations, China has the best record. President Xi Jinping's concept of building a community with a shared future for mankind represents a fundamental direction for resolving key challenges and difficulties of the world today. China will vigorously promote and implement the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative, comprehensively promote Chinese modernization, participate in the work of the United Nations on all fronts, and make our contribution to the promotion of international solidarity and cooperation in jointly addressing challenges and in safeguarding the common values of mankind. In the face of a world with intertwined change and turmoil, China will move firmly in the right direction. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of China, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to make this clear. Multilateralism is at the very heart of the United Nations. There may be different views on multilateralism, but I hope that this open debate is not intended to divide us rather than unite us. No single member state can solve today's global challenges alone. We need a collective multilateral response. Multilateralism functions only when member states work together based on mutual trust and cooperation, consistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. It is an irony, even a tragedy, that the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, continues its unilateral aggression against Ukraine while hosting an open debate on effective multilateralism through the defense of the principle of the UN Charter on the very International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. The unprovoked ongoing aggression by Russia is nothing but outright defiance of the principle of the UN Charter. The relentless use or threat of use of the veto that has accompanied this aggression has blocked the Security Council from making decisions, paralyzing and discrediting the Council when the world needs it most to fulfill its responsibility. Russia must first and foremost withdraw all its troops and equipment from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders immediately and unconditionally. That has been the repeated demand of the General Assembly, supported by 141 votes, the overwhelming majority of the member states. Let me be clear. Any attempt to unilaterally change a peacefully established status of territories by force or coercion should not be tolerated anywhere in the world. Also, any statement to deny sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, neighboring countries, or any other member state should not be tolerated, especially those by a permanent member of this Council. The concept note of this open debate circulated by Russia does not mention a single word regarding Ukraine, nor the aggression against it, and instead just criticizes many other past crises and invasions. There is no country with a flawless historical record. All of us should squarely face that reality and be humble about it. But having said that, it would be a misuse and politicization of the word multilateralism if it was solely meant to criticize selectively chosen unilateral actions of other countries. Such a narrative, in an attempt to garner support for one's own camp and legitimize one's actions, would only create further division among us and undermine the rule of law and multilateralism itself. revitalizing and upholding multilateralism is more important than ever. Let us remind ourselves, this is not the first time we have been divided. Every previous time, we found a path to overcome our divisions. So let us go back to the starting point. The purposes and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter and the rule of law underpins effective multilateralism in a world of diversity. This is why Foreign Minister Hayashi reiterated his call for uniting for the rule of law in this chamber in January. This is why Japan promotes the rule of law in the Security Council and beyond. International law, including the Charter and the resolutions of the UN, must be respected, abided by, and implemented in good faith by all. The UN should continue to be the bulwark of multilateralism. The Security Council should lead the work, not hamper it. We have to admit, the UN has never been perfect. Nonetheless, we all need the UN at the core of multilateralism. We have to strengthen the functions of the UN through reform to better reflect today's reality rather than that of almost 80 years ago, just as reminded by the Secretary General in his briefings. It is long overdue since the world leaders declared in one voice the necessity of an early reform of the Security Council in 2005. We should redouble our efforts to achieve this goal at the earliest. Japan fully supports the Secretary General's initiative in our common agenda and will continue to actively and constructively participate in discussions on the new agenda for peace. I hope that the ambitious recommendations by the High-Level Advisory Board will promote lively discussions among the member states. The future of the United Nations and multilateralism depend upon us, the member states. Let us seize it together. I thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I thank the representative of Japan, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
construit
built
sur les décombres de la
on
Seconde Guerre mondiale,
ruins
l'ordre
of the Second
international
World War,
créé
the
par la
international
Charte des Nations
multilateral
Unies
order, which was
est un
created by the
instrument au
United
service de la
Nations Charter,
paix,
is an
fondé sur des
instrument for the
principes
advancement of
tels que
peace.
l'égalité souveraine des
It is
nations,
based on such
le
principles
respect
as
du droit
the sovereign
international,
equality of
le
states,
non-recours à la
respect
force
for international
et le
law,
règlement pacifique
non-use
des
of force,
différends.
and peaceful
Ces
dispute
principes sont
resolution.
aujourd'hui violés
These
et
principles are
bafoués.
currently being
Le
flouted and
multilatéralisme, c'est
violated.
accepter de se soumettre aux
Multilateralism
règles
means
que nous avons
accepting
collectivement
to comply with
contribué
the
à
rules which
édicter
we
et auxquels nous
contributed
avons tous
collectively
choisi
to
d'adhérer
drafting and which
afin de
we all
préserver la
chose
paix et la
to
sécurité
adhere
internationale. Nous
to
devons
for
tous
the
respecter notre
preservation of
charte
international
commune
peace and
et le
security.
système de
We must all
sécurité
respect our
collective
shared
qu'elle a mis en
charter and
place
the collective
et qui
security
est fondée sur le
system
respect
which
du
it has
droit.
established, which
Nous
is
le rappelons
rooted
une
in
nouvelle fois,
respect
le recours à la
for
force,
a
sauf
law.
en cas
We
de légitime
recall
défense,
that
est
to use
illégal.
of force, except in the
Mais pour la Russie, les
for
règles et les
legitimate
principes
defense,
qui
is
sous-tendent le
outlawed.
multilatéralisme
However,
ne semblent plus
for
s'appliquer.
Russia, the rules of
Elle a eu recours
law and
illégalement à la
principles
force en
undergirding
Géorgie en
multilateralism
2008,
appear to no
en
longer
Crimée
apply.
et
Russia
dans le
illegally used force
Donbass
in
en
Georgia in
2014 et
2008,
depuis
in
plus d'un
Crimea
an
and in Donbass
dans toute
in
l'Ukraine.
2014, and for more
Elle
than 1
viole
year this
les
has been the
principes
case in
fondamentaux de
Ukraine.
l'ordre
Russia has been
international.
violating the
La
core principles of
souveraineté et
international
l'intégrité territoriale de
order, of the
l'Ukraine,
international
le
order.
droit international humanitaire
The
de façon
sovereignty and
systématique
territorial integrity
et
of Ukraine,
délibérée en
international
ciblant des civils,
humanitarian law by
les droits de l'homme en
deliberately
déportant des
targeting and
enfants
systematically
ukrainiens
targeting civilians,
et en
international
recourant à
human
la
rights
torture et
law
autres
by
atrocités,
deporting Ukrainian
les
children
embargos sur les armes
and
décidés par ce
engaging in other
Conseil
atrocities
en se
by violating
fournissant en
arms
drones auprès
embargoes
de
imposed
l'Iran
by the Security Council by
pour
procuring
bombarder
drones
de
from
manière
Iran to
indiscriminée des
indiscriminately
infrastructures civiles ukrainiennes,
bomb
violant
Ukrainian
ainsi la
civilian
résolution
infrastructure, thereby also
2231
violating resolution
adoptée par ce Conseil
2231,
en
which was
2015.
adopted
L'Assemblée générale des
2015 by the
Nations
Security
Unies a
Council,
condamné
General Assembly of the United
sans
Nations,
équivoque
unequivocally
et à une écrasante majorité
and by
ces
an
atteintes à
overwhelming
notre
majority
charte.
condemned these
Elle a notamment
violations of our
demandé que la
charter.
Russie
The
mette
General
fin sans
Assembly, among
délai
other
à son
things,
agression et
called on the
retire ses
Russian
troupes.
Federation to end
Si la
immediately its
Russie veut
aggression, to
vraiment
withdraw
défendre
its
le
troops.
multilatéralisme,
If Russia genuinely wishes to uphold multilateralism, the Russian Federation must respect the rules of international order, and the Russian Federation must cease its violations of the Charter. If Russia genuinely wishes to uphold multilateralism, it must end its war of aggression, which has unleashed dire consequences for both Ukraine and the entire world. If Russia genuinely wishes to defend multilateralism, they must immediately withdraw troops from Ukrainian soil. If the Russian Federation genuinely wishes to uphold multilateralism, they must initiate in good faith in a quest for peace. If Russia genuinely wishes to uphold multilateralism, then Russia must uphold the ruling such as the International Court of Justice, which explicitly on 16 March 2022 issued a ruling in the face of other challenges, including security challenges, health challenges, environmental, technological challenges. In the face of these challenges, only collective responses can deliver solutions. We need to address this crisis in Sudan by upholding ambitious, bold multilateralism that protects the interests of peoples and countries as well as shared heritage. Only the strict respect for the principles of international law and greater cooperation can allow us to collectively maintain international peace and security. The law of the strongest protects nobody. We support international institutions and the reform thereof to adapt global governance to reflect present-day challenges. This is the case for Security Council reform. France supports its expansion. Alongside Mexico, we have advanced an initiative proposing that the 5 permanent members collectively and voluntarily refrain from usage of the veto in the case of mass atrocities. We urge all member states to join this initiative, which has already secured the support of 106 members. France has been contributing to the considerations initiated by the Secretary General for the future of our planet and of our populations. We have contributed with the adoption of a new agenda for peace. France has also been fully mobilized for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We remain a leader in terms of global health, for education, countering food insecurity, countering climate change, protection of land and sea biodiversity. Alongside Costa Rica, France will host the United Nations Conference on Oceans in 2025. We will also host in June in Paris a summit to help secure a new global financial compact in a context where the Russian aggression in Ukraine has seriously worsened the situation of the most vulnerable countries and the food insecurity there. France has been advancing gender equality, including through the Women, Peace and Security agenda of the Security Council. We support the initiatives of the Secretary General, and France fully supports the Secretary General's recommendations under our common agenda, which calls for inclusive, effective, efficient multilateralism in order to address the most pressing challenges of humanity. Let us continue to demand respect for our shared rules. Let us continue to act for international peace and security. Let us continue to protect and promote the initiatives that are truly at the heart of an advancement of international security and international law. Thank you.
Благодарю представителя
I thank the representative of France, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Excellency, and I also thank the Secretary General for sharing his thoughts and insights with us today. Over the years, multilateral institutions with the United Nations at their heart have promoted cooperation and brought prosperity and stability. To make sure that our institutions continue to serve us well, we must recommit to a revitalized multilateral system and uphold the fundamental principles underpinning them, especially at a time when they are being undermined. This is needed to help us address the unprecedented global challenges we are facing. Enhanced cooperation between multilateral organizations at international and regional level, with the UN at the core of this work, is especially important in the areas of peace and security and sustainable development. Malta is a strong advocate for the integrity, independence, and functionality of the UN human rights mechanisms. Human rights are universal and indivisible. A transformational shift in global governance to respond to growing inequalities is also needed. Building equality through multilateralism requires the full, equal and meaningful participation of women to promote gender transformative actions and agreements. Allow me to make two observations on the concept note circulated ahead of this meeting. First, it is important to highlight that since the creation of the United Nations, the world has been widely guided by the UN Charter and its fundamental principles, among which the principle of sovereign equality of states. It is also worth highlighting that according to the 1970 UN Declaration, there is no conflict between the principles of international law as they are interrelated, and each principle should be constructed in the context of the other principles. In this context, we can never accept the results of last year's illegal referendums engineered by Russia as a pretext for further violation of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We can neither recognize the so-called republics emerging from Russia's illegitimate acts towards Ukraine and their strive for interdependence or strategic autonomy, as indicated in the concept note. On the contrary, such actions contribute to the unraveling of the rules-based order. Second, it is deeply worrying that the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, blatantly disregarded the primary function of the Security Council, to maintain international peace and security, when it launched its aggression against Ukraine. Neither can we forget that this illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war generated one of the worst refugee crises since the Second World War, a global grain shortage, hundreds of thousands killed or injured, forced deportations of children, worldwide anxiety for a nuclear disaster, and negatively impacted the credibility of the Council. On this occasion, we once again urge the Russian Federation to stop this war, withdraw its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and turn to dialogue and diplomacy as the tools which can bring stability to the region. As an elected member of the Security Council, Malta firmly believes in applying in good faith the toolbox for the peaceful settlement of disputes contained in Article 33 of the Charter. In the same vein, there is space for the Security Council to strengthen its cooperation with the ICJ and the ICC. On Security Council reform, Malta is firm in its conviction that the Council needs to reflect today's realities and challenges. To respond to true multilateralism, we underline the need for the Council to also be more inclusive. Malta is a strong supporter of the standing mandate for a General Assembly debate when a veto is cast in the Council. In the same vein, we also fully support the political declaration on suspension of veto powers launched by France and Mexico, as well as the Act Code of Conduct. Finally, Malta unequivocally supports the UN Secretary General's key proposals traversing our common agenda report. All the current OCA-related negotiations on progressing the work of the organization and enhancing the constructive power of multilateralism, as well as the work of the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism established by the UN Secretary General in March 2022. In preparation for the 2023 Sustainable Development Goals Summit, we underscore the need for the international community to take stock of the progress we have achieved so far and the gaps that remain, while engaging in intensive multilateral efforts to bridge the implementation of the SDGs back on track. We also look forward to the September 2024 Summit of the Future to advancing ideas for governance arrangements in areas of global commons. I thank you.
Благодарю представителя Мальты и предоставляю слово представителю Эквадора.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President,
deseo comenzar agradeciendo
begin
la exposición del Secretario General de las Naciones Unidas, señor Antonio Guterres. También destaco el valor del tema que estamos debatiendo, que complementa el debate organizado por la India en diciembre del 2022 sobre las nuevas orientaciones para un multilateralismo reformado, así como la reunión organizada por China en mayo del 2021 sobre la defensa del multilateralismo y el sistema internacional centrado en las Naciones Unidas. O más aún, el debate organizado por Vietnam en enero del 2020 sobre la defensa de la Carta de la ONU para mantener la paz y la seguridad internacional. Es decir que, año tras año, este hemiciclo es testigo de la coincidencia de los Estados en torno a la necesidad de un multilateralismo efectivo por medio de la defensa de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. El problema es que desde enero del 2020, en lugar de reducirse los conflictos, se incrementaron, a pesar del llamado del secretario general para un alto al fuego a nivel global. Señor presidente, si vamos a hablar del multilateralismo, es hora de pasar de las palabras a la acción y de los discursos a los hechos. Luego de las trágicas experiencias que llevaron a la humanidad a 2 conflagraciones mundiales, con la Carta de las Naciones Unidas que hoy defendemos, consagramos el multilateralismo. Nunca más le iba a estar permitido a una nación, por muy poderosa que sea, poner en riesgo la paz y seguridad de otra nación o del mundo en general, simplemente porque así le resultaba conveniente a sus intereses o a sus ambiciones. La obligación y principio de la solución pacífica de las controversias es central. Así lo reconoció el propio Consejo de Seguridad con la declaración de la Presidencia el 6 de mayo de 2022 en relación con el tema del mantenimiento de la paz y la seguridad en Ucrania. En tan solo 2 semanas se cumplirá el primer aniversario de esa declaración que todavía debe implementarse. Otro principio central de la Carta y sagrado para los Estados es la inviolabilidad de la integridad territorial. En este sentido, de nada habrá servido el debate de hoy, que hoy nos reúne, si al final de este no hay un conflicto menos, una guerra menos o una invasión menos. Señor presidente, ¿qué mejor resultado podría tener este debate que una determinación de su país de poner fin a la agresión militar contra Ucrania, conforme lo dispuso la Corte Internacional de Justicia el 16 de marzo del 2022? ¿Qué mejor legado de su presidencia si su gobierno escoge retomar el camino de la paz y retirar las tropas de ocupación? Ninguno de los pretextos invocados para agredir a Ucrania en violación de la Carta tiene asidero jurídico. Ninguno. En este hemiciclo se nos ha dicho, por ejemplo, que la invasión a Ucrania es una respuesta a una supuesta fobia que existe en contra de la cultura rusa. Se nos ha dicho que esta invasión es una respuesta a una supuesta conjura de Occidente para debilitar a su país. Se nos ha dicho que Rusia está actuando en autodefensa ante las políticas antirrusas de Ucrania con respecto a ciertos habitantes. Como acabo de decir, ninguno de estos argumentos tiene sustento en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. La Carta, debemos recordar, es una, indivisible y universal. No existe, señor presidente, una Carta de las Naciones Unidas para Occidente, otra para Oriente, otra para el Norte y otra para el Sur. No existe una Carta de las Naciones Unidas para musulmanes, otra para cristianos y otra para judíos. Tampoco puede hablarse de una carta para África, otra para Europa, otra para América, y así por el estilo. No, señor presidente, la carta es, repito, una, indivisible y universal. ¿Cómo no reconocer la enorme contribución de Rusia, incluyendo la de los grandes exponentes de su cultura, como Tolstoy, Dostoyevsky, Pushkin o Pasternak? ¿Pero acaso podríamos imaginar por un solo minuto que ellos estuvieran de acuerdo con la muerte y el dolor en millones de personas
the
que esta
death
guerra
and pain
absurda está
that
causando?
this absurd war is inflicting
La
upon
nota
millions of people.
conceptual de este debate
The
plantea la
concept note of this
pregunta
debate
sobre
asks the
cómo pueden las
question,
Naciones
how
Unidas
can the
contribuir
United
a una
Nations contribute
transición
to a smooth
dócil
transition
hacia un orden
to
mundial
a
justo y
fair and
equitativo.
equitable global
Yo le puedo
order.
asegurar
I can
que la
assure
guerra y
you
la violencia
that war
de
and
ninguna
violence
manera
will in
nos
no
llevará a un
way
orden más
lead us
justo
to
o
a fairer
equitativo,
and more equitable
sino menos.
order. Quite on the
Señoras y
contrary.
señores,
Ladies
el
and
gasto
gentlemen,
militar global
global military
superior a los
expenditure
2 billones de
exceeded $2
dólares
trillion
en
in
2022
2022.
socava por sí
That
solo los
alone
objetivos
undermines
principales del
the primary
multilateralismo
objectives of
y de esta
multilateralism and the
organización,
goals of this
como son la
organization:
paz y la seguridad,
peace, security,
el desarrollo
sustainable
sostenible y los
development,
derechos
and
humanos.
human rights.
Peor aún,
Worse still
las armas
is the
nucleares,
fact that we need
que
to
no
again
tienen cabida en
recall
un orden
that
internacional
nuclear
basado
weapons
en el
have no
derecho
place
y que desafían la
in a
existencia de la
law-based
humanidad.
international order. They defy the
Por
existence
tanto,
of humankind.
no podemos hablar del
Consequently, we
multilateralismo
cannot talk about
efectivo
effective
si no avanzamos
multilateralism
hacia un
if we do
control de
not
armas
move
y un
towards
desarme
effective
efectivo.
arms control and disarmament.
Incluso el artículo
Even
26 de la
Article
Carta de las
26
Naciones
of the UN
Unidas
Charter
se
itself
refiere a la menor
refers to the
desviación
least
posible de los
diversion
recursos
for
humanos
armaments
y económicos
of
del
the
mundo
world's human and
hacia los
economic
armamentos.
resources.
Silenciemos
Let
las
us
armas
silence the
y
guns
honremos la
and
promesa de
honor the
paz
promise of
que
peace that
asumimos
we
en San
made in San
Francisco
Francisco.
y nuestro
Let us
compromiso de
honor our
convivir
commitment
como
to
buenos
living
vecinos.
side by side
¿Qué
as
mayor
good
enemigo
neighbors?
del
What more
multilateralismo
fearsome
que el
enemy is
tratar
there
al
to
mundo como
multilateralism
un tablero de
than
Risk
treating the
o un
world
juego de
as
mesa?
a risk
Esa
board
fue la
or any
manera
board game?
como
That
entendieron el
was the
mundo las
world
potencias
view
coloniales
of
del
the
siglo
colonial powers
XIX
of the
y
19th
los
century,
regímenes
the world
fascistas y
view
nazis del
of the
siglo
fascist
XX
and
que
Nazi
invadían y
regimes of the
anexaban
20th
otras
century,
naciones,
regimes that invaded and
sometiéndolas por
annexed
la
other
fuerza,
nations,
en
subjugating them
ocasiones
by force,
recurriendo a
and at
referéndums
times using
vergonzosos
shameful
con los que
referenda
pretendían dar una
to
apariencia de
lend a
legalidad.
veneer of legality
Esa
to their
práctica no solo
actions.
que es
This
ahora
practice is
incompatible
not
con la
only
Carta de
now
las Naciones
incompatible
Unidas,
with the United
sino que
Nations
es
Charter,
éticamente
it is
intolerable.
also ethically
El
unacceptable.
Ecuador, que no puede estar silencioso
Ecuador
ante esta
cannot remain
situación,
silent
está empeñado
in
en
the face
apoyar
of
la
this
reforma del
situation.
Consejo de
As such, we are
Seguridad
resolute
y
in
el
supporting
establecimiento
Security
de una
Council
nueva agenda
reform
para la paz.
and the
Pero
establishment
no
of a
nos
new agenda
equivoquemos.
for peace. But let us
Cualquier
make no
marco
mistake,
institucional,
any
por
institutional
más moderno
framework,
que
however
sea,
modern
y
it may
cualquier
be,
herramienta de
any planning
planificación,
tool,
por más
however
estratégica y
strategic and
actualizada,
updated it
se
is,
reducirá a
will
caparazones
be
vacíos
nothing more
si
than
no se
an empty
acompañan de
shell
un cambio de
if they
comportamiento
do
por
not go
parte de
hand
los
in hand
Estados.
with a behavior
Al
change on the
respecto,
part of
los miembros
states.
permanentes del
In this
Consejo
regard, the
tienen la
permanent members of the
obligación
Security
de
Council
ejercer un
have the
liderazgo
obligation to
responsable
demonstrate
que comprende
responsible
y respete el
leadership
principio
which
de la res
understands
communis
and
omnibus,
respects the
por
principle
el cual
res
las cosas
communis
comunes
omnium.
no
According
pueden
to
ser
this principle,
apropiadas por una
the
persona,
commons cannot be
pues son de
appropriated
uso
by one
común de todos
individual
los estados de la
because the
comunidad
commons
internacional.
are there for the
Como lo
common benefit
afirmaba
of the
Boutros
international
Ghali,
community,
solo
as
un
was
poder
stated
puede
by
imponer
Boutros
el
Ghali.
orden en
Only
un
one
caos.
power can impose
Ese es
order
el poder de los
on chaos.
principios
That is the
que
power of the
trascienden las
principles
percepciones
which
cambiantes de la convivencia
move
a corto
beyond
plazo.
changing opinions
Para
about what is
concluir,
most
debo
suitable in the
recordar
short term.
que el
To
multilateralismo
conclude, I
no
must
es
recall
un
that
fin sino un
multilateralism is
método,
not an end in
pero de él
itself, but
dependen
rather
las
a
mujeres
means.
y las
However,
niñas
it is
en
something upon
Haití,
which
en
women and
Colombia,
girls in
en Yemen,
Haiti,
en
Colombia,
Afganistán, en
Yemen,
Siria,
Afghanistan,
en
Syria, or
Sudán o en
Somalia
Somalia.
depend.
De él dependemos todos
We
y de él
all
dependen
depend on
todas
it,
nuestras
and
naciones.
indeed all of our nations
Defendamos la
depend on
Carta de la
it.
ONU,
Let us defend the UN
practicando
Charter.
la
Let us do
contención y la
so by
tolerancia,
practicing restraint and
manteniendo y
tolerance,
consolidando la
by
paz,
keeping and
que tal
building
como lo
peace,
recuerda el secretario
as
general
was
en su
reminded
informe sobre
by
nuestra agenda
the
común,
Secretary General in his
es
report
un
on
bien
our common
público
agenda.
global
Peace is a
que
global
debemos
public
proteger
good
y
that we
gestionar.
must protect
Muchas
and
gracias.
manage. Thank you very much.
Я благодарю
I thank
представителя
the
Эквадора и
representative
сейчас
of Ecuador, and
предоставляю
I now
слово
give the floor to the
представителю Албании.
representative of Albania.
Thank thank you. Let me start by thanking the ESG for his remarks and pay tribute to his tireless efforts, to his clear, strong, and always principled position in favor of peace and security and of multilateralism in respect of the UN Charter. Colleagues, 400 years ago, François de la Rochefoucauld has said, and I quote, "Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to the virtue." Fast forward to this meeting, and there is a flagrant contradiction we find ourselves in today. A permanent member of the Security Council has openly and defiantly disregarded the UN Charter. That very country has knowingly and willingly transgressed every rule commonly established regarding relations between states. It has ignored Security Council resolutions and its own international commitments, and yet it has chosen to lecture the world about multilateralism as we heard today. I could go on with generalities or repeat many important aspects mentioned by colleagues around the table, but I prefer to recall the very simple facts. Russia is waging an unjustified and illegal war of aggression against a sovereign nation. It is questioning its right to exist and has the audacity to pretend to come to the rescue of sovereign equality. The Russian military, including the Wagner Group, are committing horrible crimes in Ukraine as documented by the UN, and Russia is pretending to defend universal values. Russian missiles are destroying residential areas, killing civilians, flattening schools, health facilities, and other civilian infrastructure to force an entire country into submission. And Russia has come here to share its views about friendly relations and cooperation among states. If it weren't for the thousands of innocent victims, the millions forcefully displaced, for the countless children stripped of their dreams and deprived of their childhood, for the immense pain of those tortured, of women raped and families torn apart, it would have been a parody, something the Monty Python would have entitled Preserving the UN Charter the Russian Style, Shred It, and Store It 6 feet under. Unfortunately, this isn't a parody, and we cannot laugh. What has happened in Ukraine is a tragedy, a man-made catastrophe with serious security repercussions in Europe and detrimental ripple effects around the world. It represents the contrary of everything we stand for and everything that gets us together here. Therefore, no peace-loving nation will buy an artificial parallel reality engineered to transform the aggressor into a defender of the UN Charter, the arsonist into a firefighter, and the warmonger into a peacemaker. This is the real issue, and this is what we think we should be talking about, especially on this day. Colleagues, the ongoing war in Ukraine and the current global reality pose the fundamental question of multilateralism, its future and our ability to defend it. Almost 8 decades have clearly shown that multilateralism has been and remains indispensable to promoting peace and stability, uphold the rule of law, promote and protect human rights. Today, we need multilateralism more than ever because we know that global challenges require global solutions, that we can achieve more by working together rather than by pursuing our interests individually. No country alone, whatever its size and wealth, will be able to deal successfully with climate change, transnational terrorism, or future pandemics. This requires a genuine commitment to international cooperation, diplomacy, and compromise, and the firm recognition that no country can achieve its goals at the expense of the others. This requires defending and standing by what we have agreed, respecting international commitments, and denouncing those who abuse and deform its spirit under the disguise of defending it. Colleagues, the UN needs reform to strengthen it, make it more efficient, more resultative, not to undo it. We do not want a world fueled by resuscitated imperial appetites, a world fragmented by new rivalries instead of one united in purpose. The number of poles will be meaningless and ridiculous if we fail to address the fundamental challenges posed by climate change and environmental deterioration. The UN General Assembly has confirmed several times that it will not accept a future where might dictates the right, that it will not be trolled by cynical semantics where an aggression is labeled special operation and crimes are disguised as special care. Yes, let's call a spade, since hypocrisy is nothing more than the audacity to preach integrity through depravity. And unfortunately, there was a ton of it from Russia today in a toxic mixture of everything that fits its propaganda. In particular, it has become a Russian obsession to refer to the Republic of Kosovo, a country recognized by more than half of the UN, to justify its unlawful actions in Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine since 2014, which, as we all know, is going on to this hour. The International Court of Justice has ruled that the independence of Kosovo is in accordance with international law. The same ICJ has asked for Russia to stop its war. Therefore, there is nothing that sounds hollower than the desperate effort to justify the unjustifiable and its attempt to hide behind the unacceptable. As we know, you cannot hide the sun with the finger, and today, once more, we did not hear anything on the key issue, under which article of the UN Charter Has Russia attacked its neighbor and has annexed by force parts of its territory? Colleagues, if we want to maintain the UN as the cornerstone of the multilateral world, we need to show respect for each other, not contempt. We need to show solidarity, not threats. We need to show diplomacy, to choose diplomacy and foster dialogue, not wage war. We need to work together, abide by our commitments, and we need justice through accountability for crimes committed and for the perpetrators to be held to account. In today's terms of urgency, this means that Russia must end its war, withdraw its troops from Ukraine, and respect its sovereignty and its territorial integrity within the internationally recognized borders. And I thank you.
Я благодарю
I
Албанию.
thank Albania,
Сейчас я
and I now
предоставляю
give the
слово
floor
тем
to
членам
those members of the
организации, которые
organization
желали
who
выступить
wish to
в ходе
take the
сегодняшних
floor
открытых
during
дебатов.
today's open debate.
И первым я
And the
предоставляю
first to
слово
take
его
the floor,
превосходительству
I give the
господину
as a
Херардо
representative
Пеньялверу,
of Mr. Gerardo
Порталю, первому
Peñalver
заместителю
Portal,
министра
the first
иностранных дел
deputy
Кубы.
minister of foreign affairs of Cuba. You have the floor.
Muchas
sir.
gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr.
Señor
President.
presidente,
Mr. President,
suscribimos las
we endorse the
declaraciones que
statements
pronunciarán en breve
that
el
will rather
presidente del
shortly
Buró
be
de
made by
Coordinación
the chair
del
of the
Movimiento de
Coordinating
Países
Bureau
No
of the
Alineados, el
Non-Aligned
representante
Movement,
de
the
Azerbaiyán.
representative of
También de
Azerbaijan.
Venezuela,
We
en nombre del
also
Grupo de
align
Amigos en
ourselves with the
Defensa de la
statement to be
Carta de las
made by
Naciones Unidas.
Venezuela on
Saludamos la
behalf
presencia acá del
of
ministro de Relaciones
the group
Exteriores
of
de la
friends in
Federación
defense
de
of the
Rusia,
UN Charter. We
Sergei
welcome
Lavrov,
here among us
como
today
presidente
the
del
presence
Consejo de
of the
Seguridad,
Minister for Foreign Affairs
así
of the
como
Russian
del
Federation
viceministro
as President of the
Sergei
Security
Ryabkov.
Council. We also
Agradecemos la
recognize the
celebración de
Deputy
este debate
Minister.
abierto
We welcome the
cuando se
convening of this
conmemora el Día
open debate
Internacional
as
del
we mark the
Multilateralismo y la
International Day
Diplomacia para
of
la Paz.
Multilateralism and
promovida en la
diplomacy for
Asamblea
peace.
General
This
de la
was an
ONU
initiative
por la
promoted
hermana
within
República
the General Assembly of the
Bolivariana de
United
Venezuela
Nations by the
durante
sister
su
Bolivarian
presidencia del
Republic of
Movimiento de
Venezuela
Países
when
No
it
Alineados
held the
del
chairmanship of the non-aligned
2016
movement
al
between
2019.
2016 and
Señor presidente,
2019.
en el complejo escenario
Mr.
actual,
President, in the
caracterizado por la
currently
escalada
complex
de
landscape
tensiones
marked by
y de
an
formas
escalation of
renovadas
tensions
de
and
dominación
new
y hegemonía,
forms of domination and
crecen
hegemony,
las amenazas
we
a la
are
paz
seeing
y la
threats to
seguridad
international peace and
internacionales
security
y se
grow,
debilita
and we're seeing the
progresivamente el
gradual
multilateralismo.
weakening of
La
multilateralism.
crisis multidimensional
The
global
global
agudizada por la
multidimensional
pandemia de la
crisis that we're currently
COVID-19
witnessing
impacta con
has
mayor
been
fuerza sobre los
rendered
países del
rendered
sur
more acute by the
como
COVID-19
resultado
pandemic.
del
It is
injusto
dealing
e
a heavier blow
insostenible orden
to the countries of the
internacional
South, and this is
prevaleciente.
a result of the unjust and
Se han
unsustainable
profundizado
prevailing
las
international
desigualdades,
order.
la
We've seen
exclusión social y
inequalities
la
worsen,
pobreza.
social
Proliferan los
marginalization
conflictos
heighten,
bélicos,
and
se
poverty
intensifican las
grow more
guerras
severe.
no convencionales
Wars
y
are
aumenta
abounding.
desenfrenadamente la
Non-conventional
carrera
wars are
armamentista.
intensifying, and
Se
we're
intenta
seeing
reimponer
the arms race
un orden
continue at
unipolar,
breakneck speed. Attempts have
desconociendo
been made to
tratados
reimpose a
internacionales y
unipolar order.
multiplicando las
This
medidas
is being done by
coercitivas
nations showing
unilaterales,
blatant
junto a
disregard for
otras
international
violaciones
treaties
frecuentes de la
and
Carta de
by
las
their
Naciones Unidas y
increasing
el derecho
the application of
internacional,
unilateral
que
coercive
socavan la
measures.
coexistencia
And
pacífica
these
entre
join
las
other
naciones.
frequent violations
Ante
of the
esta grave
United
realidad,
Nations Charter
se
and
reafirma la
international
necesidad
law.
de aunar
These violations
esfuerzos
undermine
para
the peaceful
fortalecer el
coexistence of nations.
multilateralismo,
In
la
the face of this
cooperación
grave reality,
internacional
we
y la
reaffirm the need
solidaridad
to
para
pool
enfrentar
efforts to
los
strengthen
desafíos
multilateralism,
comunes.
international
Urge emprender
cooperation, and
transformaciones
solidarity to tackle common
profundas
challenges. There is an
de la
urgent need
Organización de
to
Naciones
usher
Unidas
in wholesale
que nos
transformations of
permitan
the United
avanzar
Nations
hacia un orden
organization
internacional
in such a way as
democrático,
to allow us to move
justo,
towards an
equitativo y
international democratic
respetuoso de
order
la
which is
igualdad
just,
soberana de
equitable,
los
and which
Estados,
respects the
en
sovereign equality of
beneficio de las
states,
generaciones
and this for the benefit
presentes
of
y
present
futuras.
and future
Debe
generations.
promoverse una cultura de
We
paz
must
que
promote a
garantice
culture
la
of peace,
seguridad
one
y
which
el bienestar de
guarantees the
nuestras
security and
naciones.
well-being of
Debe
our nations.
revitalizarse y
We
fortalecerse el
must
papel de la
revitalize and
Asamblea
strengthen the
General de las
role
Naciones
of
Unidas
the UN General
sin
Assembly
intromisiones del
without there
Consejo de
being
Seguridad
any
en su
interference
labor.
of
Es perentorio
without
reformar
the Security
el
Council
Consejo de
rather
Seguridad
interfering in its
y
work. There is an
convertirlo en un órgano
overriding
más
need to
transparente,
reform the Security
inclusivo,
Council and to
democrático
render
y
it a more
representativo.
transparent, inclusive,
Señor
democratic and
presidente,
representative
el
body. Mr.
multilateralismo
President,
y el
multilateralism
respeto pleno
and
a los
absolute respect
propósitos
for
y
the
principios
purposes
de
and
la Carta
principles
de
of
las
the UN
Naciones
Charter
Unidas y
and
el derecho
international
internacional
law people are the way in which we can guarantee the peaceful coexistence of nations and the only way that we can guarantee international international peace and security, and the only way that we can find lasting solutions to systemic problems. We must immediately see the cessation of unilateral coercive measures and the establishment of spurious and arbitrary lists, such as that of states which supposedly sponsor terrorism. These lists run counter to international law. The world needs solidarity, cooperation, and mutual respect, not blockades nor sanctions. Cuba will continue to defend staunchly and consistently the Charter of the United Nations and international law. We will remain committed to the tenets of the Proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. With strict adherence to these principles, we reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism and to the preservation of international peace and security. Thank you very much.
Я благодарю
Thank
превосходительство
His
господина
Excellency
Херардо
Mr.
Пиньяра
Gerardo
Порталя и
Piñera
предоставляю слово
Portal, and I give
представителю
the floor to the
Мексики.
representative of Mexico.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
La convocatoria
The
a este
convening of
debate
this
sobre el
debate on
multilateralismo
effective
efectivo
multilateralism
es oportuna,
is timely,
siempre que lo abordemos en forma
provided
integral.
that we tackle this issue
Y
in a
agradecemos
comprehensive
al
fashion.
secretario
We
general
are grateful
por
to
su
the Secretary
diagnóstico
General
preciso
for his
al respecto.
lucid diagnosis of the problems
México
we
está
face.
convencido de la
Mexico is
importancia del
convinced of the importance of
multilateralismo para hacer frente a
multilateralism
los
to
problemas comunes de la
address the
humanidad.
common problems of humankind.
Pero para que este sea
However,
efectivo,
for
es
this
ineludible que los
multilateralism to be
Estados
effective,
respeten y
states
cumplan con sus
absolutely
obligaciones
must
en pleno
uphold
apego
their
al Estado de
obligations
Derecho.
with strict respect
Solo así
for
se
the rule
podrán
of law.
desplegar
It is
los
only in this
mecanismos
way that we will be
multilaterales
able
que se
to
requieran
deploy the
para evitar
multilateral
que se
mechanisms
quebrante el
required
orden
to
internacional, o
avoid
bien
a situation
para que se
where
restaure
we see the
cuando haya
collapse
sido
of the
quebrantado.
international order,
En este
or
sentido,
to avoid
los
this
actuales
order
retos
only being restored
que ponen
once
en
it has
duda la
collapsed.
efectividad del multilateralismo
As
son
such, the
enormes.
current challenges jeopardizing the
Las constantes
effectiveness of
violaciones a la
multilateralism
Carta de
are
las Naciones
huge.
Unidas,
Constant
a
violations
las
of the UN
resoluciones de
Charter,
este Consejo de
constant
Seguridad
violations of
y a
the
las
Security Council's
obligaciones
resolutions,
derivadas
and
de
constant
los
violations
tratados
of the
y
obligations
compromisos
emanating
políticos
from political
ponen en riesgo la paz y
commitments
la
and
seguridad
a range of
internacionales
treaties imperil
dentro de una
international peace
dinámica
and security
altamente volátil.
within a highly volatile arena.
En cuanto a las violaciones a
Regarding
la Carta,
violations of the Charter,
la invasión de un
the
país soberano
invasion
sobre
by
cualquier
one
otro
sovereign country of
representa
any
una
other
flagrante
constitutes
violación
a flagrant
al artículo 2,
violation of
párrafo
Article
4 de la
2,
Carta
Paragraph 4
y
of the
constituye un
Charter
acto de
and
agresión
constitutes
en
an
los
act of
términos de la
aggression
resolución
pursuant to
3314
Resolution
de la Asamblea General.
3314 of the General Assembly.
Por otra parte,
Moreover, we
reiteramos también
reiterate
nuestra
our
preocupación
concern
por
too
las
at
frecuentes
the
invocaciones a la
frequent
legítima
invocations of
defensa
self-defense
contra actores no
against
estatales
non-state
en abuso del
actors. This
artículo
is
51 de
an
la Carta.
abusive use of Article 51 of the Charter.
Señor presidente, nos
Mr. President,
encontramos
we
frente a
are currently
quebrantamientos del
facing
sistema de
the
seguridad colectiva
collapse
sobre
of
el que se
certain
cimienta
collective
nuestra
security
organización
systems on
y
which our
buena parte del orden
organization is
mundial.
built. Indeed,
El
the lion's
incumplimiento
share of the
frecuente
world order is
de las
built on these
decisiones
systems.
emanadas
There
del
is
Consejo de
frequent
Seguridad
non-compliance with
sin que
decisions
ello
of the
genere
Security
mayor
Council,
consecuencia,
and this non-compliance
merman su
doesn't
autoridad
produce any
y su
great
credibilidad
consequences. That
ante los
fact
ojos de la comunidad
undermines the
internacional y
Security
de los
Council's
pueblos de las
authority
Naciones
and its credibility in the eyes of the international
Respecto del
community and in the
incumplimiento de
eyes of the
tratados
UN's
internacionales,
peoples.
mencionaremos
Regarding
solo un
non-compliance
ejemplo
with international
que ha
treaties, we'll
sido
refer to only
históricamente de la
one
mayor
example,
preocupación para
which has
nosotros.
historically been a source of great
A
concern
más
for
de 50
Mexico.
años de entrada en vigor
More than 50
del
years have
Tratado
elapsed
de No
since the entry into
Proliferación,
force of the
los
NPT.
compromisos adquiridos por los estados
In
poseedores
that
de armas
time, the
nucleares
commitments
en
entered
función
into
del
by
artículo
nuclear weapon
6
states
siguen
pursuant to
lejos
its
de cumplirse.
Article 6
Algo
have
similar
not been
ocurre
complied
también
with,
con
far
algunos
from it.
compromisos políticos.
Something similar is occurring
En
with
materia de
political
armas
commitments in
pequeñas y
terms of
ligeras,
small
por
arms
ejemplo,
and light weapons. For
asunto del
example,
mayor
this is an
interés
issue
para
of
muchos
great
países,
interest for many
incluyendo el
countries,
mío.
including my own.
Es de
It
lamentarse
is
que continúen sin
regrettable that we
adoptarse
continue
medidas
to fail
efectivas
to adopt
para
effective
prevenir,
measures to
combatir
prevent,
y eliminar su tráfico
combat
ilícito.
and eradicate the illicit
Incluso,
trafficking of
algunos de
small
los
arms and light
principales
weapons.
países
Some
productores de armas
of the primary
permiten o
producers
toleran
of these
su
weapons allow
proliferación
or
y desvío,
tolerate the
lo cual
proliferation or
constituye un gran
deviation
acelerador
of these
de
weapons,
conflictos
and that
alrededor del mundo.
is a great catalyst for conflicts
Un
around the
multilateralismo
world.
efectivo, pues,
As
debería
therefore,
tomar
effective
medidas para
multilateralism
contener y
should take
revertir
measures to
situaciones como estas.
contain and reverse
Desafortunadamente, eso es
situations such as
difícil de
these.
alcanzar,
Unfortunately, this is
sobre todo en
difficult to
materia de
achieve,
paz y de
particularly
seguridad
in terms of
internacionales,
peace peace and international security, when this council is paralyzed by a veto being used by a small number able to halt the international community's action.
multilateral legal bodies continue to have a limited scope. Consequently, we need to achieve the universality of the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. We need to make progress with the acceptance of the ICJ's jurisdiction. Reality is proving to be quite different. After almost 80 years, less than half of the UN member states accept the ICJ's jurisdiction. In conclusion, discussions such as that we're having today are necessary and timely. However, the challenges facing multilateralism greatly limit our organization. Preventive diplomacy and mediation, this has already been said, must be genuine options which go hand in hand with the vital reform of the Security Council if we really do wish to move towards a more effective multilateralism. As such, Mexico tables a proposal for a reform of the Security Council, which is comprehensive. The goal of this proposal is to lend momentum to negotiations underway within the General Assembly. Thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Мексики и хотел бы напомнить всем уважаемым ораторам о просьбе ограничивать продолжительность своих выступлений 4 минутами с тем, чтобы Совет мог оперативно завершить свою работу вовремя. Я предоставляю слово представителю Исламской Республики Иран.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Mr. President, we acknowledge Rashida Presidency for convening this important and timely open debate, and we thank Minister Lavrov and the Secretary General for their insightful views and briefing for reaffirming the significance of multilateralism. Mr. President, multilateralism has been recognized as a well-established approach to addressing global challenges, and effective multilateralism operating within the framework of the UN Charter is essential for ensuring international peace and security. Achieving this requires a strong commitment to upholding international law, promoting transparency and accountability, and adhering to the principles outlined in the UN Charter. The UN Charter establishes a comprehensive framework of principles and norms that member states must adhere to in their relations with one another. These principles include peaceful dispute resolution, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-interference in internal affairs, the prohibition of the use of force, and the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. By abiding by these principles, member states can promote a stable and secure international legal order that benefit all nations and peoples. In the meantime, multilateralism must ensure the active participation of all nations, regardless of their size, wealth, or political orientation. The exclusion of any country undermines the principle of inclusiveness and may result in biased outcomes. All countries, especially those directly affected by decisions made through multilateral mechanism, should have an equal opportunity to participate, contribute, and to be heard in the decision-making processes. Mr. President, Excellencies, the integrity and effectiveness of multilateralism are undermined by the abuse of UN systems and selective application of international law, as well as the use of unilateralism, which poses a serious threat to international cooperation, peace, and security. Unilateral coercive measures, including their extraterritorial application, represent a concerning example of harmful unilateral acts that run counter to the fundamental principles of international law, the UN Charter, and basic human rights. These illegal measures have far-reaching humanitarian consequences and can undermine diplomatic efforts aimed at resolving dispute and promoting cooperation. Within this context, the United States unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA, reimposition of illegal unilateral sanctions on Iran, is coercion of the other countries to engage in these illegal actions, and defiance of International Court of Justice order are striking examples of how much harmful unilateral acts violate the UN Charter, undermine the UN systems, and threaten the multilateralism. in this recent judgment on 13 March 2023, in the case of concerning certain Iranian assets, the International Court of Justice has declared that the United States has violated its international obligations to the Iranian people by imposing unilateral sanctions that are deemed illegal under international law. The ICJ's ruling is final and binding, requiring the U.S. to comply with this decision. In conclusion, Mr. President, collaboration should be the cornerstone of multilateralism rather than confrontation. Collaborative approach fosters trust, builds consensus, and promotes sustainable solutions to global challenges. Through collaborative problem solving and engagement with all parties, multilateralism can effectively address the challenges facing our world today. In this context, diplomacy, dialogue, and negotiation should be the preferred means for resolving dispute among member states. I thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Исламской Республики Иран и приглашаю выступить представителя
الوزير سيرجي لافروف. السيد الرئيس، أهنئكم على رئاسة مجلس الأمن للشهر الحالي وعلى اختيار هذا الموضوع الهام.
We wish to congratulate you on your presidency of the Security Council this month of April, and we commend you for the choice of the theme for today's meeting. This is a theme which is of paramount importance for Egypt in the light of the challenges which our world has been encountering. It is incumbent upon us to work towards surmounting these challenges which have been affecting developing states, specifically African states. Today we are discussing reinforcement of effective multilateralism. This needs to be more effective through within the United Nations system, and in this regard it is incumbent upon us to base ourselves on the principles of the United Nations Charter, which was the founding document for the United Nations. Let us recall a few historic elements. First and foremost, the signing of the Charter in 1945. This was a turning point in the history of humanity. The international community took an informed decision to base international relations on cooperation, on consensus, on justice, on peace, on peaceful coexistence, on collective security, on equality in terms of sovereignty, and on non-interference. Egypt is among the founding nations of the organization. Egypt has also played a key role in the creation of other international organizations and regional organizations, specifically the African Unity Organization, known today as the African Union, as well as the League of Arab States, the Organization of Islamic Conference, which is now known as the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, as well as we have contributed to a number of initiatives of regional groups and coalitions and interregional groups of coalitions such as G77 plus China, as well as the non-aligned movement. 75 years have elapsed since the inception of our organization, and we have observed a number of alarming practices. First and foremost, the setbacks and backsliding in a number of key principles which were at the heart of the creation of our organization. There have been attempts at interference in internal affairs of states under various fallacious pretexts. Second, the monopolization by certain countries, specifically certain major powers, monopolization of decision-making without consultations with states in the concerned regions, specifically African states. And in this regard, let us recall the evolutions in Africa that have been observed over the past 7 decades. These developments mean that African states' opinions need to be taken on board. Third, there's been double standards and a number of files, and these have affected political relationships as well as links and ties and relationships among other countries. Fourth, attempts by certain states to politicize international fora, and this has undermined the ability of these fora to act. And this has undermined international multilateralism, specifically through international trade as part of development and countering climate change. Fifth, the attempt by some
وهو
downplay
بالغ
the
الخطورة
role
فمع إقرارنا بدور
of
المجتمع
states
المدني
by
وغيره من الأطراف
attributing
غير
greater
الحكومية
importance to the
إلا أن
actions of
هذا الدور
non-state
يتعين
actors.
أن يظل
This
داعما
is
للجهد
particularly
الحكومي
alarming
ومكملا
if a
لجهود
number of
الدول وليس
non-state
بديلا
actors
عنها
have
أو
an
خصما
opportunity
منها.
to play a
السيد
positive
الرئيس
role
ترى
in
مصر
some
أن
files. This
الإصلاح
does not
الشامل
mean
لمنظومة
that they can replace states
الدولية
or
المتعددة الأطراف لن يتأتى
engage in
سوى من
or
خلال بعض
to
الخطوات
compete with
الضرورية
states.
منها
Mr. President,
توصل الدول الأعضاء إلى قناعة
overall reform of
بأنه
the
لا سبيل للعيش
international
المشترك وإعلاء
multilateral
قيم
system
العدل
needs to be based
والمساواة
on the
إلا عبر
following.
العودة إلى
Number
مبادئ
one,
الميثاق
all states need
بوصفها أساس
to
التوافق
be
الدولي مؤسس
convinced of
المنظومة
the
الدولية
need
الراهنة
for peaceful
مع العمل على
coexistence based
تطوير
on
هذه
justice and
المبادئ لمواكبة
equality. To
التحديات
achieve
التي
this,
تواجه
there
البشرية.
is a need to revert
ثانيا
back to the
العمل الفوري
principles
على
of the
إصلاح
Charter of the
منظومة
United
الحوكمة
Nations
الاقتصادية العالمية
to
في قلب منها منظمات
the
بريتن
various
وودز وغيرها من
challenges which we
المؤسسات
currently face.
المالية الدولية
Two, there's a
وهي
need
خطوة
for
ضرورية
reform of
لتمكين
the global
الدول
economic
النامية
governance
مواجهة
system
تحديات
within
عالمية
which
مثل تغير
there are
المناخ
the Bretton Woods
والأمن الغذائي
institutions.
وذلك اتساقا مع ما
We
نادت به
need
مصر
this
بدعم
reform
من
in
قادة
order
العالم
to
والسكرتير العام في قمة
surmount
شرم
the
الشيخ للمناخ
challenges of
العام
climate
الماضي
change
فضلا عن
and
إصلاح النظام
food
التجاري
security
متعدد الأطراف.
on the basis of an initiative which was
ثالثا
submitted by
إعادة
Egypt
النظر في
during
منظومة الأمن
COP27 in
الجماعي
Sharm el-Sheikh
المحلية
and on the
المتمثلة في
basis
مجلس
of
الأمن الذي لم
the
يعد معبرا عن
need
الواقع
to
الدولي
reform
الراهن
the
بعد عقود
multilateral trade
من تعقد
system
الممارسة
which
الدولية
presently has been
وتدعم
affecting
مصر بمفاوضات
economic
حكومية
development,
لإصلاح مجلس
sustainable
الأمن
economic
وتدعو
development.
كافة الدول
Three,
لتبني رؤية
we
شاملة
need
التي
to
قدمتها إفريقيا
re-examine the
توازن
collective security system
إيزولويني وإعلان سرت بما يصوب
by
الظلم التاريخي الواقع على
allowing
الدول
various
الأفريقية
regions to
وجعل
play
مجلس الأمن
their
أكثر عدالة
role and by
وتمثيلا
reforming the
للعالم
Security Council by
النامي.
correcting
يتعين
the
أيضا العمل
historic
طبعا مع
injustice
الآليات
for
الإقليمية
Africa based
والمنظمات
on the
الإقليمية.
El-Swahili consensus
السيد
as
الرئيس
well as the
تشارك مصر
CIRT
بفاعلية
declaration.
في الحوار الدائر
The
حاليا حول
Security
مستقبل
Council also
المنظومة
needs
الأممية
to
وإعادة تموضعها
improve
في
its
عالم
working methods
متغير
and to
وتتابع
enhance
باهتمام
coordination
أفكار
and
والمقترحات
cooperation
القيمة
with
التي
regional
يطرحها
mechanisms,
السكرتير
specifically
العام في
African
أوراق السياسات
mechanisms to find African
وتحضيرا لقمة
solutions to
المستقبل
African
العام
problems.
المقبل والتي
Mr. President,
تستند
we
إلى ما
have
سبق أن
been
طرحه في
proactively engaged
تقرير
in
أجندتنا
dialogue
المشتركة
on the
ونتطلع
future of our
للإسهام الممل
organization.
المهم
And
لتطوير أجندة جديدة
we
للسلام عبر
have
شراكة
been
فعالة مع
closely following
المنظمات
the various
الإقليمية.
proposals
هذه
submitted by the
فرصة
Secretary General
سانحة
specifically in
يتعين
the lead up
عدم
to
إهدارها
the summit for
ونعمل
the future,
لبناء
as
التوافق
well
الدولي
as
على
through
ذلك
our
الصعيد في
common
العام
agenda and the new
شكرا
agenda for peace. We believe that today's meeting should grant us an opportunity to seize these various opportunities to move forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя
I
Египта
thank
и
the representative
предоставляю
of
слово
Egypt, and I
представителю
now give the floor
Пакистана.
to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, first of all, let me say it's a profound pleasure, personally, for me to see you preside over this meeting of the Security Council. The Pakistan delegation also thanks you and the Russian presidency for organizing this important debate on international security and effective multilateralism. We also thank the Secretary General for his important briefing. Mr. President, today, international peace and security confront multiple threats arising from violations of the principles of the UN Charter, great power rivalries, a renewed global arms race, proliferating conflicts and disputes, spreading terrorism, hate and Islamophobia, organized crime, rising poverty, and growing climate impacts. We believe that these multidimensional and global challenges can be overcome only through multilateral cooperation. We reject a unipolar, bipolar, or even a so-called multipolar world if it is dominated by a few large and powerful states. Such an order would be contrary to the principle of sovereign equality of states. We seek effective multilateralism, a multilateral order constructed on the basis of the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, one in which each member state has an equal voice and an equal stake. At the same time, we must express our concern at some new concepts advanced in some of our discussions within the United Nations, such as multi-stakeholder and networked multilateralism. These concepts, too, are contrary to the UN Charter, which envisages an international system composed of equal and sovereign member states. Mr. President, effective multilateralism can address the current and emerging threats to international peace and security. A critical part of this endeavor must be to promote universal and consistent respect for the fundamental principles of the UN Charter by all states, irrespective of their size, power, and influence. To this end, the UN Secretary General should prepare an annual review of situations on the Security Council's agenda where the Charter's principles and its resolutions and the resolutions of the Security Council are being violated or remain unimplemented. The Security Council must take bold decisions to secure the compliance by states with the Charter's principles and its own resolutions and decisions. The Council has various means available to it under the Charter to secure such compliance. The Secretary General has rightly mentioned decolonization as a major achievement of the United Nations. Yet, a prime illustration of the derogation from the Charter and the Security Council's resolutions is the situation in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where the exercise of the right of self-determination by the Kashmiri people, prescribed by the Security Council, has been subverted and suppressed by India through 7 decades of force and fraud. Another is the situation in occupied Palestine. Protestations of commitments to the UN Charter ring hollow when no action is taken to redress these blatant violations of the UN Charter and resolutions of the Security Council on 2 issues which have remained on the agenda of the Security Council for the last 75 years. Secondly, Mr. President, if the world is to avoid global catastrophe, it is now essential to redress the rising tensions between the major military powers. We hope that a sincere effort will be made to end the war in Ukraine on the basis of the Charter and international agreements. We hope that tensions will not be further provoked in Asia. We are concerned at the expansion of military alliances and the escalation of military expenditures and capabilities. These developments also threaten peace and stability in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. Mr. President, the summit of the future next year should reaffirm the solemn commitment, especially by the militarily significant states, to refrain from the use or threat of use of force, respect the UN Charter's principles, implement Security Council resolutions, restrain military expenditures and provocative deployments, and eschew military blocs and alliances. Mr. President, rising global tensions have undermined the entire edifice of arms control and disarmament. An uncontrolled arms race, which now encompasses several new weapons and new domains of competition, will sooner or later lead to a disastrous conflict involving states armed to the teeth with conventional and nuclear weapons. The United Nations can and should take the lead in reviving the process of arms control and disarmament based on the consensus achieved at the 1978 First Special Session on Disarmament, whose central principles were equal security for all states, ensuring national security at the lowest possible level of armaments, and the preservation of military balance and mutual restraint at the global and regional level. We must also outlaw dangerous military doctrines, especially the presumption that conventional wars can be fought between nuclear-armed states without fear of nuclear escalation. Mr. President, the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Secretary General can do much more to promote the peaceful settlement of disputes through the multiple modalities available under the chapters 6, 7, and 8 of